Okay, we are live, it looks like. Okay, I'm John, and I'm here with Nick, who I found on Paul Vanderklay's channel. I don't know if how many people, sorry, I had to mute the live stream on the other tab, know of Paul's channel. This is Nick, who's had, I think, 4 conversations now with Paul, kind of going into his storied past with cults and Peterson and his travels and different things like that. Quite a lot of interesting backstory to him. In fact, we can get into it in a little bit. I guess just to get into why we're doing this right here, I listened to Nick's recent conversation with Paul, and he started to touch on a lot of the stuff that I've been kind of recently thinking quite a bit about and trying to formulate into a understandable and comprehensive philosophy just for myself and being able to think about these types of things. I just, what was it? Last Friday, I had a debate on the Modern Day Debate channel with biblical history skeptic going over the topic of objective morality. And since that was my first debate, it was kind of, I was quite unprepared for it. But I think what I was trying to argue is, and it didn't do very well in trying to articulate my points there. So maybe hopefully through some of this conversation, I'll be able to try to get my point across a little bit better than I did there. Because I was arguing in the pro side of objective morality, but I wasn't doing it in the typical moral realism sense where moral facts exist. Something sort of like that. But anyway, so we can probably get into that later on, but first, want to introduce Nick here to the Bevry channel. Say hi.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay, Nick. Your the stories that you go into in your conversation with Paul were really quite interesting. So you've been a part of what, 4 cults now? Is that how, like, you would self-describe them as cults, or did some of them, like, they refer to themselves as cults in some instances, actually?
Only one of them self-described as a cult.
Gotcha. But you recognize the other ones as being cults themselves.
Yes.
Maybe we could actually get into your working definition of cults, because I know you had said, I think in maybe your first conversation with Paul, that you kind of think about everything through the lens of being a form of cult or kind of its own type of cult. So yes. What do you mean by cult then? Like, what's your working definition?
Well, when I claim those 4 as cults, I'm usually functioning off the more colloquial idea, which is like a small isolated community with a pretty rigidly defined power structure. I guess, I think in that first video, I had made a claim that the world as we're partaking of it is fundamentally cultic. And so you can assign in some way what's a good way to say it? It's hard to talk about, or to sum it up briefly. Fundamentally, anytime we're operating in the world, we're operating on some sense of belief. So even, like, for instance, money. Mm-hmm. The reason that money is valued is not because it has an actual, well, it has a very minimal actual value in the sense that it's paper. Yeah. So by agreeing to exchange money and to believe that it has a value, a symbolic value beyond its physical nature, we're actually partaking in a cultic framework. And that you could even actually stretch that all the way to more classic ideas of cults, in that it does actually have a pretty rigid power structure, and it does concentrate towards a certain point. And you've got a Federal Reserve that's defining. So, and then on a broader sense, you could say that people will submit themselves to the idea of the dollar. such that the way we're interacting with it is almost as an authority.
I see. So we're kind of like adopting the the fiction that the Federal Reserve creates in the production of money, even though they're producing, let's say, $100 bills at like a fraction of a penny, just to
Yeah.
do so. Even though, so the actual cost in producing this paper fiction, it is minimal, but because everybody else within that kind of, I guess, cultic frame accepts this. There's another word besides fiction, but kind of accepts this proposition that's put forward, and they share in this proposition. And so, yeah, I can see what you're meaning. Like, so would each are these like cults kind of all part of the same system, or kind of, I guess, overlapping in different areas, like maybe to each specific domain or field that you might go into?
Yeah, the way I would view it is basically a huge number of interrelated cultic systems. And then, for example, when we say a word like culture, what are we actually talking about? Well, one way to understand culture is a kind of super group of cults. And so if we were to break down American culture, for instance, it wouldn't make sense to do so without both breaking down, what what American Black culture is, and then what American white culture is, and then how those two cultures relate to each other and the connections that they form. And then, so it gets really complex really quick. But I don't know how you could almost imagine it as like an enormous Venn diagram.
Uh-huh.
And then I would say that some of the I don't know if powerful is the right word, although that's what it almost ends up becoming. But there's kind of ground level cults. So cults that's only function is to enable
further cults kind of to be built up off of them.
Yes, exactly. And so I would put money in that
Yeah.
category because it doesn't have a strict it will, and that's tricky too, because money does have actual morals written into it in a way that's really not obvious. So and it changes. So for example, a banker's perception of what money is very different than what a layperson's idea of money is. And then within our culture that's all operating using the money, we have ideas, you might call them kind of subconscious ideas, or I don't know what the right word is, but that say, for instance, money is the reward for doing something that you wouldn't necessarily want to do. And so we get these kind of subtle definitions that work themselves into these more abstract bases. And of course, that fluctuates heavily.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was discussing it in money. It reminded me of, I think it was like quote, or not an exact quote from Voltaire, but something like an observation, I think, by Voltaire, that like even though the Muslim and the Christian have completely different value sets, you can notice that in the marketplace they're able to interact with each other. And I think you made a good point. Like it's almost this lower resolution, I guess, cult or idea set that is out there that enables people to interact with each other on, say, on a non non-violent method, just through a reciprocal means, without having to have any sort of shared identity between each other. Like the only identity that you could say is actually like connecting between them two would maybe be the identity of accepting the value of money. Like even if you don't believe that paper money has any inherent value within itself, you can still accept the practical fiction that everybody else believes it, and so because everybody else believes it, I can use it for my own means in gaining what I consider valuable truly within itself.
Yes. Yeah. What another interesting point too, just because we're on the topic of money, is looking at how the cult has changed, right? And it did so in the
Like
17,
when
1800s. Well, so we went when fiat currency became the dominant mode of currency, right? That was a major structural change in how people related to value and how value itself functions. So, with fiat currency, we open up the door to fractional reserve banking, which is literally creating value out of nothingness, right? That's something that was totally impossible before when we had currencies based in tangible goods, right? If we had a gold-backed dollar, then you needed the gold there in order for the money to represent any kind of value. Right. Without that, you can't just multiply gold, right? You can go dig up more of it and put more into circulation that way, but you can't just take one coin of gold, chop off, 10% of it to hold, and then say, it's now magically worth 3 times as much as it was a second ago. Right. So there's my point here is that there's actual cultic. Again, I'm using the word cultic probably too much here, but there's rules that aren't actually based in anything real that are defining how we go about interacting with these symbols, really.
Right. Yeah, that's good. It's actually quite good. I guess maybe delay your backstory with cults, because this I think leads well into what I have been particularly thinking about in regards to say ethics, where it seems like, I guess, working off of that idea where everything is kind of its own cult. Maybe I haven't been thinking about it in regards to cults exactly, just because I have I guess less experience with thinking about cults. But I've been thinking about how every time you utilize a methodology, you have some sort of implicit value that you're acting towards in order to attain or to achieve some sort of end that you like presuppose as being of more either use or to your preference or to your liking, or of more objective value to bring about than in comparison to anything else. So I guess I'll go into I guess mathematics for now. There's a way where, okay, in order to actually perform mathematics, you kind of have to remove all types of particulars. You're not thinking about things as they are in their empirical form at all. You're kind of abstracting out from that, and you're creating a symbol aligned to that specific thing, even to the point where you no longer even need the objective thing in reality, but you can just have the symbol. Okay, instead of one apple, you just remove the apple and you still have that concept of one. And within this concept of one, there's a definition kind of like hidden within it that, okay, half of one times itself, it still remains one. Also, within the definition of two, there's like 2 times 1 hidden, like, so even by definition, the definition of 2 includes 2 times 1, and like within the definition of 1, it's half of 2 itself. These aren't necessarily like, I mean, you can make observations of reality in it, but for these things, but it's like
you're making axiomatic transformations that then allow you to create a concept of truth within the framework.
Yes, you're making.
But you first have to make the axioms of, here are the definitions of these
exactly
qualities. And then we're trying to match those axioms so that they relate most to reality. So that's where a lot of that, if you're so now if we bring back the apples and you say, well, now I have 2 apples and then I take 1 away. Right.
And now we're with our mental concepts. Like
Yes.
you can actually, like, that's how math actually kind of works in reality, because like we have the abstractions, we work with the abstractions, and then we can sometimes make predictions based off of those. Like I think that's how, like, they made using Einstein's calculations, like Hawking and Penrose, I believe, were able to predict that black holes were a thing. And then afterwards, like,
Then the black holes have
yeah,
hair theorem. Yeah.
yeah,
The famous
but
debate between the two of them.
sure, yeah, I guess that's further outside my knowledge scope. But I understand what you're saying. In like, there's the the axioms that we use, and then we build up from there. And it's not like these axioms are provable exactly. They're more like we accept them, and then from the things that we accept, we can build up from there. And this is where I think of every methodology as being prescriptive rather than being descriptive, exactly. Because like, if we were being purely like descriptive, there would be no abstractioning out from our observations of reality. Like,
Yeah, you would be
within,
stuck with the apple permanently,
yes,
and you
exactly.
probably wouldn't even be able to call it an apple.
Yeah, exactly. Like, even calling it an apple relies upon the category of apple that we're using, rather than one component of the universe. And even like just
An
saying one,
interesting,
that's a separation of the universe into this thing and then the rest of the universe. But
yes, yes. And another interesting thing, just to throw in real quick here,
mhm,
is how fundamental this abstracting quality is to the human organism. So when you
mhm,
go, when we look all the way back at the oldest cave drawings and everything, it's heavily abstracted images. They're not images, they were not trying to replicate exactly what they were seeing. Realism in art came way,
mhm.
way, way, way afterwards. Even though if you were thinking in that context, you would assume that the earliest art would have been an attempt to literally mimic something that the person was looking at. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see hyper stylized, abstracted images of uh, or representations of real things. So there's a part of this that's also important to keep in mind, that we're really deep into that symbolic, that abstracting
Yeah,
quality.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
It's almost like we're like, they're evolved innately into us. And like
yeah.
we think inside of symbols. Like,
Yes.
through the use of symbols, we're able to think even. Uh,
Yes. And getting that to actually relate to reality is the hard part. That's
mm.
the part that it starts to this complexifying pattern arises. Um,
Okay, so what do you mean by that? A complexifying pattern?
so it's when we take the abstractions and try and relate them to real things it's almost like this automatic process of building up starts to emerge.
Hmm.
Um, right, and this, I mean, there's a number of ways you could try and explain this. I like to use entropy just because I think it's interesting, but that might be not the easiest, or just a kind of pointlessly complicated way to say it. Um, What's another way? We could think of it almost as Peterson's order and chaos, right? And how the optimal place to be is right on the boundary of order and chaos. Well, it's that attempt to balance order and chaos, right? Trying to get right to that center line. That's where complexity emerges. Because if you have only chaos, that's not complex at all, right? It's just chaos. It doesn't have any, we have no ability to see into its patterns. So instead, we blanket everything in a kind of perfect evenness.
Hmm.
And then with hyper order, we also have a reduction of complexity.
Right.
That would be like the pure abstraction. So if we have chaos, which is the real world on one end, and abstraction, which is, say, the rudiments of mathematics on the other, it's in the attempt to merge these two polarities, or to sit in the middle of them, that we start to see a truly complex pattern arise. which, right, what makes arithmetic go from arithmetic to calculus? Well, it literally was trying to describe the real world, right? Newton and Leibniz. The whole reason calculus exists was to describe physics.
Right. Okay.
And then we can keep going with that, right? The abstractions in mathematics, group theory, and all these other systems that we've come up with. They arise because we're trying to explain reality, not because we are trying to become more pure in our abstraction.
Right. Yeah, that's always kind of the thing, is like we can create these like axioms and models to work off of, and then through that we can get some sort of like predictive results or things that make sense. But it's like if we stay attached to the axioms that we have, and we try to work things out from, okay, so like the Ptolemy's model of the solar system, where the Earth is in the center, and then the sun and the other planets revolve around it. That's kind of like our start, not really our starting, but that's their like starting model for understanding the orbits and just understanding how everything works. And so that's kind of like using Petersonian language, the known, the part of the known world. So like we have our axiomatic structures that we use, and then from there we can create the models that accept the axioms that we've put into place. And then as we work up from there, we can reach almost like building a Tower of Babel, something like that, where you keep growing higher and higher till it gets to that point where the things get much more confusing. And like you can keep on trying to use the known world that you have, the structure that we've built up from, but as you keep attempting it, if your axioms are incorrect or like trying to work even further outside of their scope of relatability, like or their own sufficiency, then you kind of have to like start creating the epicycles, where you have to add in more information than is kind of necessary, and maybe might not make enough sense. And so that's kind of where you have to, once you get to that point, at least you have to accept the unknown or the chaos to, I guess, build up from there a new set of the known world. And that's kind of the thing, like all the time the axioms that we accept are always kind of not really floating in midair, but at least resting upon what we don't know. I guess that's kind of like a Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
Or even, right, it's almost like we don't even, you just have to start with a single axiom, and it almost leads you to that thing that doesn't fit.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Oh wait, but that, right, the true but not provable, and then that true but not provable is always pulling us through meta layers, in a sense, out of our own theories, into a theory that encompasses that specific true but unprovable. So now it becomes true and provable, and now there's a new true but unprovable, and then we keep repeating the cycle. And then, of course, the whole time we're pragmatically bumping it against the experience of existing.
Yeah, that's a good bringing up,
doing what it's supposed to.
Yeah, bringing up pragmatism, because I think that's a strong like influencer to what types of axioms we accept. So like you can like take the common syllogism, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's a simplification that occurs in that first premise, where Socrates were kind of putting into this abstraction of man. It's not like there's men, but we're removing the particular of Socrates, an actual person in history, and relating it to this abstraction that we have of just man in general. And then from there, we're working from that abstraction, all men are mortal, That's another like presupposition that we all accept just because it's so like all of our experience that we have acknowledges, and like this axiom seems to be applicable to all experience in regards to like men and mortality. I mean, it has nothing to do with like apples and counting, anything like that. But for all practical purposes, in regards to the subject that we accepted already, like the categories within the premises we accept, and then from there, yeah, we get the conclusion. But it's okay. So yeah, within pragmatism, where the reasons that we accept the axioms that we start off from is due to how we can apply these premises and use them in our own day-to-day life, or not even day-to-day life, but whatever field that we're within. So like you utilize the axioms of mathematics within the field of mathematics. It's not like you use the axioms of mathematics when like going on a date with your wife, something like that. It's non-applicable.
Although bizarrely, you can.
I guess so.
It just takes a lot of metaphorizing in order to translate it backwards.
Yeah, I guess so. Like, yeah, probably wouldn't be a very happy wife.
That cross-contamination of abstract systems is actually how we learn a lot. That would be like a process of synthesis.
Yeah, that's true.
And,
like you. That's something I love about like reading people's books who have like a very narrow framework of looking at the world. So like you read an evolutionary biologist and they relate evolutionary biology to every single thing in the world. I read one of my favorite books is Don't Shoot the Dog, and she's a what's her name? Karen Pryor. She's a dog trainer, and also like she looks at everything in regards to incentivization and decentivization, where like you're like every interaction you have with a person is you incentivizing some sort of behavior and de-incentivizing some other certain behavior, and then from that they create a habit or some sort of feedback loop that they're working off of from there. And it's like
good point for the cultic world.
Right? Yeah,
we are all manipulating each other, whether we are doing so consciously or not.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, like even just like when we're not doing something, like sometimes that's what gets incentivized, which is even harder to think about. Like all the things that we're not doing is being incentivized or de-incentivized every time we're incentivized by some specific thing. Okay, but okay, where was okay, yes. So I have this, I guess, way of thinking about ethics and morality in regards to kind of these types of axioms that we accept. And I think about methodologies as almost a form of ethics for like certain things that we accept as a simplification. And whether or not this simplification is like an accurate, true description of reality is kind of inconsequential, because it's like whether or not it's like universally true. Socrates, all men are mortal, is a truth that, like, even though it's unprovable, kind of like the black swan fallacy, you can't like, or like even within the domain of science, you can never prove anything exactly. You can just prove things not true, just based upon like, okay, you have a hypothesis, and then you found the one thing that kind of disproves that hypothesis. Now you know that this hypothesis is false. At least you can never like prove anything is true, but you like we have these simplifications of reality, such as like all men are mortal, and then we can work from there. It's almost like this simplification, or actually that's even further from where I'm talking about. I want to go into ethics and how okay, so take the game of chess. There are rules for what each piece does, and to the point where like there's the rule for the rook that it can only move horizontally or vertically. You can't move it diagonally. Now that's not a descriptive claim, because if I'm playing chess, I have full capabilities of moving the rook diagonally. That's an invalid move, though.
Or so off the board.
Yeah, exactly. I can throw it away. I can break it in half. I can do an infinite amount of things with these pieces. But prescriptively, there are like the true by definition rules for how you're going to play chess. And it's like what keeps the rules in what keeps the rules, I guess, enforced is the participation with another player, or even just your participation within reality. So like you could take the rule of like don't get in between a mother bear and her cubs. That's like an ethic that you can adopt, but it's not like a description of reality. It's it's an inhibition of behavior. Like you have full capabilities of walking in between a mother bear and her cubs, but if you were to do so, like your life would be ended.
Vastly more danger than it would be otherwise.
Yes, exactly. So that's like, okay, so when we adopt certain principles or ethics or rules, like even in just like a game of chess, something like that, there's the, like, I guess an implicit understanding that it will be, it won't kill you, at least. That's maybe at least for a lot of the ethics that we adopt, or something like that, where like there's the common understanding that the reason you adopt an ethic is because it's going to lead closer towards your goal. So like within the game of chess.
Within chess, it would be having fun playing the game.
Mm-hmm. Well,
fundamental in many ways, yeah. Right? Because if you could break the rules, but if your only goal is winning, right now you have the goal of, well, I might as well break them because the goal is winning. Except that if you win that way, it's not actually satisfying or fun to play the game. So we create the system of rules so that when you do win, it's actually meaningful.
Yeah. I think this might be, I don't know, this is at least something I'm thinking about, and it seems to have applied pretty well. But all ethics are an inhibition of behavior. So like you have a certain like capacities and potential actions that you're constantly capable of doing. But when you adopt, say, a cult's set of practices, or, well, I guess with cults there are, I don't know. This is maybe where I can get into it with you, is whether or not you can think about ethics or a group's morality or a cult's set of behaviors and practices as only inhibitory, or maybe there's, I guess, there is still the, I guess, proactive types of behaviors that you can have, where, say, like within the Catholic Church, there's the set of behaviors like whenever you enter a pew, you kneel and maybe even do the cross. I'm not Catholic. I just know this from observation. So I guess that's not.
I might have some ideas here that would be useful. Yeah. I think part of it is that in order to motivate any behavior, there has to be some amount of restriction in some place, right? And this comes from kind of the hierarchical structure. We need something to make certain things more salient than others. Now, a lot of these are given the conditions of, being a biological organism and wanting to stay alive. So you have hunger and things like that kind of give us strong innate motivations.
Yeah, like if you can adopt the ethic of like, don't drink water. That's as an inhibitory action. But that's an ethic that will only last you, what, like four or so days, something like that, before you just.
But the flip side of that is that if you have the ethic not to drink water, it might then boost activities that you wouldn't have done otherwise. So now maybe instead of drinking water, you start eating tremendous amounts of fruit because there's liquid in them, right? So you're trying to make up for the sense of thirst. And because of that, it's incentivizing a different set of behaviors that you hadn't even necessarily thought about before the prescription of don't drink water. And that's kind of the point I'm getting to, is usually where we put in restrictions in our ethic, it is in a sense blowing up another area that then becomes a direction that we want to move in. So it's almost like Right. If you're restricting water flow, you're also deciding what the water's going to do once it's out of the restriction. You're doing both at once. So it's
okay. I think I see like a devotion of resources out away from yourself towards some other, I guess.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be an external goal, to be honest, right? It's more of just like when you're looking at almost how cults structure themselves or why they might structure themselves. Usually they'll put really rigid boundaries in certain areas of a person's life, and then they'll have areas of tremendous freedom in other parts of the person's life that wouldn't necessarily exist without those restrictions underlying them. And I think this is a whole part of creating salience, right? Or I shouldn't say creating, because again, a lot of it is a given, but manipulating salience. And I think that we don't really have a way out of this type of manipulation of salience.
So salience, as in like bringing thing like an emphasization of certain values, I guess, like the de-emphasization of other things that like a cult might, or people prior to the cult might have been first interested in. Okay, so just to like take an example, there's some example brought up by, oh, this is Tyler, by the way. Nick, this is Tyler. I found Nick on Paul Vanderklay's channel. I think you're familiar with Paul's work. He's a reformed pastor that's been like diving into Jordan Peterson's work.
Yes, you're both California boys, right?
Yes, from California, or not? Well, I guess I am from California, but I'm also currently here.
I think, yeah.
The ambiguity is a little interesting, perhaps. How can you guess? Is it just the length of time you've been there, or you've been there, left, and come back?
Yes.
Yeah, I do the same thing with Florida. I'm a Florida boy.
Oh, okay.
Polar opposites.
We got the whole country covered there.
East Coast versus West Coast thing going on here.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So
I'm very familiar with Paul.
Right.
Fascinating guy.
It's funny because while listening to Nick and Paul, he reminded me quite a bit of you, Tyler. And so I think there's actually, it's almost like, at least to me, you two are like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, you put
like
that in chat here, so I'm
coin.
fascinated. Of course, I'm very curious.
Okay. Oh man. Okay, we were going into cults. Okay, and okay, yes. So the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, who actually kind of like specializes, or at least recently specializes in like religions and like communes, religious communes, and different like cultures and things like that. He brought up this point, like this one like free love type community, something like that, had very inhibitory like restrictions for absolutely no I think technology or even like using of cars, anything like that. That's like completely prohibited. But and like recycle, a lot of inhibitions in regards to that. But besides that, like the entire community was like completely free. Like you could have whatever religion, whatever type of sex, anything that you really wanted. Because, and it's like the hard and fast like set of restrictions for this one domain completely allowed there to be this sense of community and trust and I guess shared identity with each other in this other domain, to the point that they were able to just freely work with each other in all these things that we would normally consider as being like strong, I guess, boundaries and barriers between people.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and you could say the same of the ones that we accept currently as normal. So when we have very rigid boundaries between intimate relationships, which is coming from largely the Judeo-Christian, backdrop. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's many reasons for it outside of that for it to have existed, but it boosts behaviors in other ways, right? When you restrict that much energy, and particularly that, right, restricting sex is a lot like restricting water, in that it's one of those areas where it's not necessary, but it's such a powerful motivational drive that it's going to produce a lot of excess energy that you can now redirect towards something else. And I would say commonly this was redirected towards some form of labor. It's a lot easier to get people to work a lot more if you've restricted heavily that specific drive. But there's a lot of other things going on there as well. Like, it's commonly brought up that, without that, you end up with women generally collecting around highly successful men. Then you get a marauding crowd of males, which in certain societies would be extremely advantageous. In our current ones, that's not advantageous.
Yeah, because you get a lot of.
If you're a Mongol under Genghis Khan, it is extremely advantageous. You want a bunch of men that don't have women or families, because it's part of your, culture's imperialistic conquest. So I'm getting off track here, but there's a really complex thing going on. And I would say that when you allow absolute freedom, so it's just a free-for-all, you actually end up with really heavy amotivational problems. Just because you have, in a sense, flattened or at least heavily softened the person's salience field.
Okay, so that it's really interesting. I can definitely see like the truth behind it. I'm interested in, like, so is it that salience can be created by way of, I guess, creating ethical structures then, or maybe not just ethical?
I would say manipulated more so than created.
Okay, so this is actually good, because like what I was attempting to argue in my debate, and I only got to go into it very little, was that we can determine the objectivity or the objective truth behind, say, ethical statements or value-laden statements of, like, what one ought or ought not to do, or should or shouldn't do, based upon how effective that practice is in achieving the goal. Whatever, like, every time you say you should do X, I think there's an implicit goal within there that is, like, not necessarily stated, but it's assumed, and then you can kind of determine. Okay, so I guess just to go with chess, like, you ought to move your rook vertically or horizontally, like that, or maybe to put it the other way, you ought not to move your rook diagonally. And within that, there's, like, as long as you're reading the context properly, there's the implicit goal of playing a game with your opponent in a way that they are going to be playing the game with you. So, like, if you want to play the game, I guess you can take it as a Kantian hypothetical imperative. Like, if you want to play a game of chess, here are some things that you ought to do, just because, I guess, based upon the nature of chess, these are the prescriptive rules within it. Like, if you're moving the rook diagonally, it's not a game of chess, it's something else. And your opponent isn't going to be sure of what you're doing. And, like, there's a way in which, like, if I'm going outside the rules in order to play whatever game that I'm playing reciprocally, the person I'm playing with is not going to be able to trust me or predict my behaviors. This is something Peterson brings up a lot. Like, we have culture and common rule sets so that we can accurately or we can have some amount of predictions for what a person is going to be doing. Like, if you're in a classroom and then you start getting up on your desk and start yelling, this suddenly puts everyone else within that classroom into a state of chaos, because it's completely unpredictable. This person has acted outside of their accepted role for being in that classroom. Like when you're in a classroom, you're supposed to be quiet unless you've raised your hand or the person has asked for questions, things like that. There's an accepted set of rules and roles for what you're going to be doing within this fiction or cult of a classroom that's there.
Well, and the background goal, you could say, is that you're to make it as efficient for everyone in the classes for everyone in the class to learn as much as possible. That's the reason. That's the fundamental goal, and then we're setting up dynamics around that. So it's gonna change a lot depending on the variables of the classroom. For example, it's going to be real different if you have a class of 300 compared to if you have a class of 10, right? If everyone's trying to maximally learn in a class of 300, then pretty much everyone has to shut the hell up. But if you're in a class of 10, then it might, and you have, allotted period of time, then conversation is going to be raise in your value system, because it's going to allow the people to integrate the information at a deeper level than if they're all sitting silent, purely listening to a person lecture. So you have your background goal, the supposition, and then we play with all these other dynamics to try and come up with the best answer. So with the chess example, right? One goal is to win and to create a system of rules such that winning is a possible thing to do. That's our fundamental. You need a game where someone can win. And you might say you want a game where a person will win every time. So, right, you don't want a game. You might not want a game where people can tie, or where, right, there's some other variable there. So that's already going to heavily restrict your set of rules about how the game is going to carry forward.
And then can we define winning? What does it mean to win? A la Donald
That's
Trump,
a good
perhaps. What does it mean to win? So much that you...
I mean, that's within the context of a game.
Mm-hmm.
You would have, that's tricky. That's not nearly as easy to answer as it should be.
It's kind of meta, isn't it?
Yeah.
It presupposes the subjective participant, the player, right? The outcome is assumed. And I think it's something like the subjective experience of the reception of resource gain. And in the human experience, it's something like the positive experience of a resonance, right? So like the activity you just participated in now resonates in a kind of flow, an internal flow, a pleasant networking of the internal resources rather than a turbulent flow.
Yeah, that's okay. So in certain games, there are like physical, tangible resources that you do win, like cash prizes, something like that. But even in like games of, say, like a game of chess between you and a friend, there's the resource of, I guess, status or competency, if we're going into Peterson, in regards to that domain.
So I think we should never lose sight of the fact that no matter how abstract a concept, there is always a physical structure we're assuming associated with it. If we're assuming that the whole kind of brain-mind correlation, right? Mm-hmm. So through the looking glass, right, essentially, on the other side of the external coming into the self, once it passes into the brain, whatever neural networks, whatever little organisms, as Jung came to call them, right, the archetypes, whatever little personalities have lived inside your brain need resources to continue living, right? And they produce this this need, this cycle to run resources through this system, else they die, right? And the organisms that have built up on Earth over time have kind of demonstrated a weird geometric shape of what we're in now, right? That is successful over time in maintaining this homeostatic kind of equilibrium. This, as Piaget ended up moving into the equilibrated game is the one that exists throughout time. And it has something to do with, as you said, in the classroom, the integration rate. I think it's something like whatever the energy exchange rate seems to be, it has to be in a flow. It has to be non-turbulent. It has to be useful. So you need like repeated expected patterns. And in the formulation of a game, those expected patterns are the rules that allow you to restrain the potential behaviors. Do you remember learning to play chess? I try to teach my kids chess every now and then. It's really fascinating because you can almost see the process of restrictions that go on, because initially the pieces are able not just to move on the board in squares, but squares don't exist at all. The board, in fact, doesn't even exist, right? Like they're tossing it all over the room. They're like doing battle in the air, smashing into each other. I kind of remember doing that as a kid, I think, but there are no rules, right? It's just pure unrestrained imagination localized in these objects. But then you start teaching some of the rules, and that restrains behavior further as it kind of narrows the grand universe of capacity and possibility into these narrow little 64 channels, right? These little bits. I feel like so you mentioned, so we're having a discussion about ethics. I'm sorry, I just kind of popped in the middle. I'm just going to go with the flow, so to speak. I don't know if I'm interrupting anything important, but yeah. So ethics are funny, right? This is always a really big topic, especially in politics and on YouTube and all. And what's funny about the game of chess is it's not always been the way it is, right? It's a very old game. So long before it passed through Persia and ended up over here, and like started probably somewhere in the subcontinent, India, that like it's changed over time. It has become more equilibrated, let's say.
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah, I can see.
Towards the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about how things like the rules of chess are prescriptively true rather than like a description of reality, something like that. Like the rule of like you cannot switch between a rook and a king in one move. It was like prior to the rule of castling. It was a rule that like you can't do this just because of the rules that we have for it. But and then like I guess through that invention, the axioms or the rules that we had in place can be adapted. And
well, go back in time. Try to reimagine the scenario where this occurred, right? So it's probably some guy's just getting beat like for the 100th time by the guy across, always kicking his ass in chess, right? And it's the same attack over and over again. He just can't figure out how to get. He comes to get your king right in the middle of the board. So now you say, all right, look, new rule. I get to switch these two pieces like this.
You would have to be probably like the grandmaster in order to just create a rule like that where anybody would accept.
It's just you and your friend in a small village. And like maybe several villages across the country are playing something similar, but just you and your friend adapt this new rule. And your friend's like, that actually makes it more interesting for me. Now I'm not just, beating you so easily. Now it's making it a little bit more difficult. I kind of like that rule. And so when he goes to the next village, he brings that rule with him. And the rule catches on. It makes sense. People are like, oh, that's interesting. That makes sense. Let's incorporate that new rule. And this is how the rules change over time. And you see this in real time, especially now. I don't know how much you follow chess, but even Bobby Fischer, someone who's at the peak, right? Who's at the very top. What did he do? He got tired of playing regular chess and he develops Fischer 960 or whatever we called it, right? Fischer chess. And that is where you're no longer constrained by the starting positions of the board. Now you can put the pieces wherever you want. You maintain the pawn row, I think, at the front, but you can switch anything back. This is an elaboration on the rule set because he was tired of the way that chess is being played, the memorized book openings. So
he kind of became chess's Ubermensch.
So could we say that what people are aiming for is for the experience of winning to be maximally meaningful within the context.
I think actually ultimately what
We
can
could root
say,
meaning here in this case too to like actual serotonin release or something like that.
yeah. Well, so that's just an extraordinarily elaborate structure, physical structure built up over eons, right? Who knows how long it has been? But if we just go a little bit deeper, we can essentially say that the universe prefers flow, like non-turbulent exchange of energy. It prefers something like patterns repeating. It prefers solar systems, galaxies. Evolution and life seems to be rooted in other words, if we were to try to extrapolate the most, the very bottom layer, the most primal layer of rules that the universe runs off of, physics calls them like the physical laws of the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're just talking philosophically, let's say. These bottom level rules that about how it constrains our behavior. I mean, it really is just a big chessboard, right?
There's a tricky bit there, though, which is it's not technically repeating patterns. Otherwise, we would have been satisfied always winning with the same cheap move.
Yeah,
It's
right.
almost that there's a constant repetition that is endlessly variable.
Right. Yeah. The fractals.
And we're kind of like trying to balance that ability to repeat with the ability to continue changing through the repetitions.
Right. And it's the exchange of energy in a non-turbulent way, in a pleasing way that produces newness, creativity, that creation. We were talking about procreation before, right? The physical union of man and woman, the act that is in fact why sex is so often controlled in these kinds of cultic relationships. I mean, and in general, you can just consider the earth as a cult, right? Like if you do your various narrowing and expanding of systems, like the earth is a cult of humans, right? And then we have just these subsets of cults going down. There's no ultimately rational explanation for why mini skirts and not fursuits or something, right? Like, and that's why we're ending up in the strange place that we are now with the internet, right? Where fursuits are a thing. So there's an element of that, I think, that's extraordinarily important for us because we have a long history in, at least in the West, in the United States in particular, of judgment, of making strict judgments about what is and isn't the way a thing should or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And this, I think what this produces is like these boundaries that can no longer be crossed, right? Information can no longer flow. In a family, this represents a situation where a parent can no longer talk with it.
And yet, if you don't have rigid enough of boundaries, you also lose the pattern. It gets infiltrated by chaos, and now you don't have
viruses.
It becomes overly turbulent.
Mm-hmm.
You lose that kind of magic spot in the middle. So it's tricky. It's almost like we need to make rigid boundaries while knowing they're a game. Well, and yet it's almost like we can't sustain that because if we know it's not a real rule, then we
it's hard, especially in our own day and age. It's very hard to accept like made up things that we as if they were like fully true facts, things like that.
And yet we would all play chess and follow the rules of it.
Yeah.
So it's weird, right? There's something
kids, like, can't get it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is like something I actually wrote in my journal last night, is kind of going over the different like dogmas that a group or a cult or a religion or a ideology will accept as a simplification tool to act as if is a reality. So like within the popular Marxist communist cults or ideologies of today, there's a meme that goes around of property is theft. There's actually another one that's profit is theft, bringing that in. And so it's kind of this slogan that they have that it's, to me at least, it reads as this is a rule set now that we're prescriptively adopting, rather than it being some sort of like, I mean, it's technically like a fact insofar as the methodology that they use for looking at the world, say maybe through the value theory of labor, something, or some sort of Marxist lens. This is like the produced result to that methodology of looking at the world. So like maybe materialistic the dialectic materialism. This the framework of dialectic materialism produces this fact of profit is theft, and that new fact is what is used as the dogma for this moral community. And then from that moral community, like everyone within that moral community accepts this dogma as if it were fact, and they will interact with the world as if this fact is true, and like with the common understanding that like theft has an automatic negative connotation, so that anyone that exploits another person through profit or through private property or something like that will be treated as a violator of the moral community. Like they've thieved or they've stolen somebody else's resources through the practice of employment, something like that. And because of that they can excommunicate or they can punish in some sort of way, like killing the kulaks or something like that through their own moral community, something like that. And yeah, and I think,
well, and they actually alter the world through the acting as if. So you can start with a fiction that creates a feedback loop that makes it no longer a fiction, and then it starts to look real. So that could be a criticism you could level at capitalism, is that it's describing the world in a certain way, but it's been so powerful a system and has affected the world for so long that we can no longer tell the difference between the capitalist world and the world as it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then when you have people supporting it, they are actually stuck in a feedback loop and think it's just how things are.
Yeah,
like it gets really, but that's the power of a cultic framework.
Yeah, if you accept the lens of capitalism, then like you look at the world entirely under the
what is the lens of capitalism, though?
Everything in regards to their monetary value or production value, perhaps. Like every person isn't a end unto themselves; they are rather a production mechanism for value and the creation of resources to a higher degree than without that person. So like every person doesn't become like an individual person, but more of a cog in the machine of the production of value. If you were to
that's more like a slightly idiosyncratic description of the way the world works, right? I mean, it's not.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like each lens that you adopt has an element of truth within it because it's based off of like an empirical.
I'm not arguing against capitalism, by the way.
Neither am I. Really. I'm just using both of these as an example.
My point, before I belabor it too much, which I'm so fond of doing, I think is that we use terms that are so heavily loaded and charged on purpose. Many people use them this way. That's why you say something like property is theft or profit is theft. You all you have to do is insert the word theft. People who end up in this spectrum politically are the ones who associate highly charged emotional states with words. That's why they're so fascinated with trigger words and all that nonsense, right? They hear a word and new experience an emotional reaction to it, and for whatever reason do not seem to be able to divorce themselves from it, right? So I was thinking it would be interesting if you just, it's like radio dials, right? Like they tune in to this particular resonance frequency, right? This emotional resonance frequency. We need if you could reprogram people. But I think what's happening is they are getting programmed. They're getting programmed to narrow their perspective to this very binary black and white, right? By using these labels like capitalism, right? So we say capitalism does this, capitalism does that. In reality, it's large groups of various independently acting people, self-interested, behaving in various ways with overlapping motivations, some of which are communistic, some of which are capitalistic, some of which are hedonistic, some of which are religious, some of which are secular, like all of them intertwined in this braid of extraordinary complexity, and trying to disentangle that and say, this particular phenomenon in culture and society is attributed precisely to this word I use called capitalism.
Yeah.
It seems so absurd to me now, like the more that I try to untangle where influences come from in a system, like where motivations come from, the history of ideas, the history of where, like the momentum of things, right? It's so impossibly complex. And I think we have to restrain
that complexity, or we need a heuristic in order to actually act. Otherwise, we become so bound in the particularities of things that everything is exactly as it must be.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that position, there's actually no incentive to, or not even incentive. There's no impetus to will, or I'm not sure how to put it into words, but
it does seem highly tied to willpower, the ability to make an effective change in your environment. It does seem tied to that. This is why you get all these weird shades in the religious wars, like Islam, submission, like jihad, struggle, right? It's all couched. Everything's couched in this in the language of personal desire versus the universe writ large, and whether or not it allows you to achieve your aims, and whether or not you attempt to force further with more and more energy to achieve your aims, which is very Western industrial revolution kind of idea, right? If you can't do it, you just build a bigger, stronger, faster, smarter machine that can.
Yeah.
Or do you move more towards the Eastern mindset
of allowing?
Right. Let the desires go. Relax your restraint and control on the world, and move towards a more simplistic, narrow bandwidth.
And it is, the most recent cult I was in described that difference as there's almost kind of two spiritual, I hate using that word, but let's go with it for a second, almost fundamental ideologies. And one is, both of them admit in some sense that to exist is to distort reality. So we could say that one spiritual goal then is to make this distortion unbreakable. So to make it almost all powerful. And we could call that almost like a Western
That's
view.
The left hemisphere, yeah.
And then the other would be to neutralize this distortion so that it has no reality of its own. However, the impression of the world affects it, it just becomes whatever the impression is.
And that's
and then directly transmutes it.
That's so perfect. Yeah. Yeah, so our brains are always, like, you and I are talking to each other right now, but it's our brains, we're talking to each other. And Ian McGilchrist's work on what the hemispheres are doing and what they're interested in the world is really fascinating. And I think everybody should read into it and really study it. If you haven't already, you should. But that's it. That's it exactly. There are two slightly strangely different ways of going about seeing the world. I guess not only two, but if you further subdivide one, the first further subdivision you get is two, and you cut it in half, right? So from ego, we get two hemispheres, and because you can go forwards and backwards in this, and that's interestingly the idea between the East and the West. It's purely the difference between two forces in the universe. This is again going all the way back down to the bottom stack. Let's say there are forces of convergence and forces of divergence, and that's really all you got.
like the open hand and the closed hand, accepting reality or changing reality, like not accepting reality.
Yeah, and it's so that whatever passive and active components of consciousness are at play, it's something to do with the modulation of electromagnetic fields. It's something like that, right? Through various weird chains of information and momentum. Like it's just it's highly complex, but it seems like we're devoted to that, right? Like all of this up here is devoted to that.
Well, especially the neocortex, right? It's primarily a inhibitory part of the brain. Is that correct? I don't know if that's correct. That's like a pop scientism.
Yeah,
that
I'd
seems
say
to
that
move around quite a bit.
little too pop to make much sense because there are elaborate new structures that produce elaborate new activities, and there is some new research that shows the corpus callosum is actually involved in a lot more suppression and inhibition of.
Really?
Mhm.
So, but it's like the inhibition of like the
opposing
the mammalian like automatic instinctual responses. So like if say somebody slaps you in the face, something like that, there's an automatic kind of response to that. But the prefrontal cortex, I think, like allows you to inhibit that like automatic reaction of say punching the person.
You were talking about water flow earlier, right? You can think of it like that. So imagine you have little plumbing cycles in your brain, and you get smacked in the face, and you have a little plumbing loop, which is once you get smacked, that pressure pushes the water from one tank through a series of pipes out the other tank, and that other tank is right. It's leading with the right hook, and that's just your loop, right? But when you're 5 years old, your dad sits you down and he says, "Son, when you get angry and somebody hits you, count to 10 and think about it first." Okay. Now, what he's doing right now with his words, with the resource he's giving, he's eating food, he's taking the calories, and he's turning it into pure energy right out of his mouth, and he's transforming that child's brain and building a new structure. Right? It's a new structure. It's a new set of pipes. And
getting a dispersal of energy rather than an actual stop of energy.
Well, it's a buffer, is what it is. That force of water still flows. You still get hit in the face.
Yeah.
But rather than go directly, it buffers into a new region. And that energy is getting utilized in a new way, which is thinking about, is it going to be worth? Is it
funnels it into meta-analysis instead of right?
Yes. Okay. So when you force with pressure, right, it builds new structures. That's the key. And that's exactly what the neocortex is. It's new structures mushrooming off of the old ones, right? And I think that's just true in general for all.
I see. That's why it happens to begin with, or why it presumably happened to begin with.
Yes, structure follows behavior. See, we're so I'm firmly.
Yeah, we're always putting ourselves at the whim of
it's the other direction. Well, in evolutionary biology, it's seen the other way around. That behavior follows structure. That we behave a certain way because of the structure of the genes, and it's. I think it's the other way around. Like that's looking at it from the wrong side of the looking glass, right? That's looking at it from like the Queen's view instead of Alice's view. Let's say, we are in fact building the structure as it goes. That's what consciousness seems to be doing.
Well, and that's I remember. And he never got back into this, and I'm kind of bummed that he didn't, because it's a really interesting topic. But that relationship, I was talking about Peterson. I think it was the conversation he had with the Buddhist woman on Unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
And he got, I think it was that, but it might have been a different one. But he got into the conversation about the relationship between memes and genes. And how it's not nearly as easy to parse as we would like it to be, where you have genes that create the basis of memetic frameworks, and that's that. But it's actually a kind of feedback system where they're creating each other.
Yeah. So that's
But you
like,
always do end up in chicken or egg problems with these types of things, trying to say this is the one that happened first.
I think you can. The best way to view the universe is just as the flow of energy through structures, right? Over time. That's it. That's all it is. And we have given various weird names to various weird structures over time. But
so, what are the forces in that framework, though?
yeah, it seems to be motion. And
well,
what do you
as
mean?
in the well, right, we have the four forces, the gravity, electromagnetic, strong and weak nuclear, and they seem to appear as arbitrary restrictions, right? Like the strong nuclear, for instance.
Yeah. The values that we've measured seem to be arbitrarily chosen, right?
Well, I don't even mean it in that, like, arbitrary in that sense, so much as arbitrary in that we don't actually know what is restricting. So, right, we have energy vibrating space-time. We call that vibration in space-time a particle, except that there's no, we can't quite isolate the reason that the vibration stays stuck in space-time instead of just liquidating out into the rest of the fabric. Why didn't the universe stay permanently uncreated, I guess, would be a a question.
Why is there
or stuck as a waving of space-time?
Yeah.
Why did it split into the energy and matter instead of just staying as energy?
Like, why is there the appearance
because
of order?
it's way more interesting that way, right?
It certainly is, yeah.
That's if you are okay. So we exist now. We're conscious. As many people want to deny that as they can, it's still true. Consciousness is real. It exists, and if that's the case, it's very likely that it exists elsewhere, or has existed, or will exist forever. Right? These are all potentials because it exists at all. And that is the unique strangeness of it. But I don't know. It seems pretty clear to me. Like the great game of consciousness is it's something tied to, and this is something rarely discussed. I think aesthetics of beauty, what notions of beauty are in love, what it means, because love is just a word that we use for desiring to be close to or attracted to. What was that? Was that a cat meow?
That was my sister. Hold on.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call her a meowing cat.
We'll blame the tech for that one.
Yeah. But then we have hate opposed to love, which is the desire to destroy or remove from your presence. And then we have all these weird extrapolations on versions of these things. Like I really do see everything as fractals now, as spectrums and as fractals. Like they're really we make these very arbitrary decisions about where to call a thing a particular thing. And,
well, that's the thing.
Nowhere are we learning this more than in medicine, by the way, right? Where we say a human organism is this particular way in this particular shape, and then we find out, oh, but if you kill the gut bacteria, the human dies too, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, you can't actually divorce the organisms living on us as not part of us, or else the human disappears.
Right. And so when you realize that that's one extraordinarily small thing that we've overlooked, perhaps, and that there's a whole range of other things that we're overlooking and are unaware of, and the way that the organism is maintained. We keep finding out new and stranger things, right? I saw something recently where the infrared energy emitted by all things, essentially being powered by the sun, could potentially be involved in helping force water molecules through capillaries in the human body, helping the heart pump, right? Like,
oh wow,
yeah. Like this kind of extraordinary balance of energy and cooperation with forces is just it's
like an infinite complexifying pattern.
Yeah, and we just draw these,
which I guess is a fractal. Yeah.
Yeah, so we draw these boundaries based on linguistic economy of words, and also based on historical successive rule states. Essentially, is what each organism is. And when we draw the boundaries, they're always porous, right? We have developed a better understanding that there are no hard lines in the universe anywhere. There has to be pores. There has to be a way to exchange energy of some kind. And the key, though, in a living organism, we were talking about this before, is not necessarily that there are rigid boundaries, but that there are rigid boundaries with appropriately composed gates within them that only let in and out those things which are beneficial to the successful reproduction of the organism. Right. And any deviation from that represents some kind of pathology now. So,
well, I want to at least. So the distinctions that we bring up, they're not drawn upon exact like hard lines between reality that we can differentiate between things exactly, but there is still the practical utility behind certain distinctions in reality, rather than like you can't always conceptualize yourself as an insignificant speck in the universe of in all its intensity and immensity. There has to, like you have, in order to act within the world, you have to accept that there is this thing called you, or what, John for my own case, and then work off of that. Like
no, I think okay, all right,
adopted.
Okay. I think this is the best perspective. All right, ready? You're not this small speck, and you're not the big giant John, some egoistic monster, right? And this is what's so beautiful if you really blow this idea up, actually. At any given subjective experience, you are always perfectly in the middle of things. You can think of it like that. So infinitely above you, there are systems of energies that you'll never have any control over. The galaxy's spinning and you'll have no say on that, John. I'm sorry. The universe will continue on without you. But what you do have control over is this tiny little microcosm in the grasp of John, right? And what you do have sway over, the God of John and his devotees are the microbiome, right? The gut bacteria. They're dependent upon your choices. If you run and jump off a cliff, all your cellular structure, all of it dies. You are the god, so to speak, of that realm. But it's a middle position. It's like you're piloting this place where below you there are these incredibly complex systems just ever descending down. Physics is telling us, right? Organism to organelle to cell to proteins and molecules and atoms, and it's just all that goes down. And you're not really controlling those. You're controlling this middle layer in between the great universe expanding and the great quarks below you. You're piloting this weird middle ground. It's like the golden mean, the Aristotelian golden mean, and whatever it is to exist is like balancing this strange wavy fractal creation of newness. Like the edge of creation is this weird balancing act. It's very odd, but I think that perspective is the best because it avoids the egoistic
solipsism.
Yes, yeah, and the collapse of nihilism and into meaningness of being a nothing.
And it seems like what another way to describe that is that we're aiming for synchronicity among all of those layers. So it doesn't.
It's like a translator. Like I think of it like that, like an appropriate translator of information up and down the stack. Like you can.
I see. So yeah, efficient, and it almost becomes based on efficiency. A metaphor that I've played around with for a while is that we often have the conception of ourselves as a type of cave, and we'll act accordingly. So, right, if you're imagining yourself as like a cave-like space, we go around collecting energy, storing it in the cave, and then releasing it on whatever. It's got a whole set of rules, but it's heavily defined by this filling a limited space and then releasing back out. Whereas I think another way to view it is as a tunnel. And the difference between your strategy as a tunnel as opposed to a cave is really different, because a tunnel, what makes the best tunnel, for instance, is its efficiency at moving things from the entrance to the exit.
Yeah, because like,
so it's more of like a
conceptualize
free flow of energy, or in this case, the translation between the micro and the macro, or greater than the macro. Whereas a cave conception will always act as a block.
Yeah, like as if you can accrue resources for an indefinite amount of time, when in fact you can only store them for a period of time before like you end up expiring, or the resources themselves that are accruing end up dissipating.
See, my brain does weird things. This is why I have a problem with categories and labels and words in general. But like if you squash a man down to just kind of a block of flesh with his arms and legs flailing, let's say, maybe if you took Leonardo da Vinci, right? Just this little block of flesh and arms and legs, and just squeezed food through him, right? Just squeezed food through him for 60 years and kind of saw what came out of him, right? See, we break up the history of things as though like he was a body walking around. But in reality, it's no stranger than the fact that there was this weird little organism that you shoved resources in one end and it shot out this insane creativity at the other, right? Like you squeeze it in one end and it comes out the other, but the arms and legs are flailing and producing what, right? I mean, Bach, pick any great artist. But like that's so odd, right? Like the strange vibrations produced by that. And we get locked into these very narrow ways of viewing the world. Like we call each other Republican and Democrat, as though that is the way that you are going to act, right? And I guess it has probably to do with that efficiency thing. The brains seem to be highly devoted to efficiency. The universe seems to be devoted to efficiency. I've been tempted to call sin something like
well, we need the heuristic, and then that's not bad. Oh man, I forgot what I was going to say.
We need the heuristic.
I got thrown off by that last comment.
like for Republican.
Yes. Just there's also a weird interrelationship between our heuristics, right? Because there's the efficiency that's creating the heuristic, we could say. We want to be able to quickly and easily demark a danger from a not danger, or whatever. And then the bizarre fact is that once we've created the efficient path or the heuristic, we actually start smashing ourselves into it, right? It becomes the path we take over and over and over and over again, and it becomes the favored path, say, through that area of the brain over all the many other paths it could take. And so through the creation of the heuristic, we actually start to truly make a world that represents the heuristic. So we again get locked into that self-creating what is that, like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense.
Yeah, like going back to the discussion of like sitting down the 5-year-old, like when you get hit, count to 10. That's like a heuristic that you can apply, and like as you get hit more and more and more, you I guess work into that. But I guess also, like besides that, there's that point where the heuristic itself is insufficient, just because like it's devoting too much, I guess, like aggression or pressure that is receiving. Like if you hit somebody enough times, they're going to pop, and that's like when the heuristic itself gets overturned, and like I guess the Nietzschean Übermensch of like stepping outside of the set of ethics for that has been like culturally indoctrinated into you, in order to like step outside of that and apply yourself when these ethics are I guess self-destructive in a sort of
When
way.
when they're no longer adaptive to the environment is what it
Yeah.
is. It's when you no longer resonate. So you can define like a resonance frequency as something like the environmental frequency is that which where the organism survives, right? So whatever this weird resonance is, like as the organism attunes itself to the environment, it finds the proper vibrations or it doesn't, right? And whatever ones eventually persist through time, they get encoded in these weird little
Yeah, that's so interesting how the heuristics
structures.
like embed themselves into like basically instinct. Like
Yeah. I mean, you'll find any animal out in the biological environment. Like they're not like a lizard's not learning how to crawl up and down a tree from its parents. It's completely programmed behavior, right? But it's behavior nonetheless. So strange how that's possible, but
yeah, like when a horse exits the mother's womb, it starts walking immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't need to be taught how to walk. It's something that's innate within it. Like for a human child as well, there's already that breast sucking like motion innate within them as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, but that brings up another interesting thing, because it's not purely efficiency, but it's also not quite adaptability, but it's something like it, almost like an anti-fragility, right? So it's like you want a system that actually improves when it gets punched in the face, as opposed to able to resist getting punched in the face. In a sense, that's not the best example because our improvement is not in the bone structure or whatever. But
that's good. Like
growth, maturity. There are words that we could use, I think, in the biological realm that deal with this. Yes, right. The immune system adapts over time. And John, do not let me cut you off.
No, I was just thinking like in regards to group moralities or ethics, where like you have a system of ethics for a certain period of time for your own people, at that like you have a certain ease of predictability for how other people are going to act, and then like you become, I guess, adapted to that like closed system, even though it's not really a closed system, but like a closed enough system for
much more limited system.
Yeah, exactly. And then like once somebody from outside that system enters into it, then you're suddenly vulnerable to all of the I guess additional behaviors or capabilities of this outside presence that you're like just to bring it into an example, like the Native Americans, they had their own system for how to understand the world, and then when the Italians come in and there's a whole new set of like a whole new world for them to have to adapt to all of a sudden, and the world that they adapted to was one within their own inhibited system or closed system, and making them vulnerable to this outside system. So like exactly in order to have some sort of anti-fragility, you have to have a system that is capable of interacting with and being strengthened through interaction with things outside the system itself.
Yeah, has to be able to adapt.
It has to be able to consume is how I've understood it.
This is the worst part.
And this brings us back into the cultic idea, right? Because what kind of defines a classical cult is almost a really heavy isolationism. And this is pretty much a death sentence. The moment a cult turns insular and forms rigid boundaries is the moment that it's in its process of dying. And so we could say that one of the characteristics of what makes a healthy cult or culture is its ability to synthesize with new information fairly rapidly. And I'm not sure if there's a limit on that rapidness of ability to synthesize. Like if there's a too fast where now it's actually destructive in the other direction.
Yeah, have you ever tried to drink from a fire hose?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there must be I don't know how we would represent that. Maybe like alien technology or something like that, or even our own technology.
In terms of communication science, there is a theoretical upper limit to the amount of information that can be transmitted before you lose the capacity to guarantee the information. That's the Shannon limit.
I see.
So there are some kind of upper bounds, I guess, but
wouldn't that just be determined upon like your interpretation structure? So like there's a certain like word limit for speech itself, but when you're like speaking through sign language, there's a way to communicate, or even Chinese calligraphy. There's like within one character, there's like 10 words, and so you can read a paragraph or the equivalent space of a paragraph within the English language, and instead get like a whole page of a book within Chinese or Japanese or something like that. So it's like dependent upon how much information is integrated with a symbol
encoded into the symbol. Well, and that's the same heuristic, right? We say ethics, but when we are using the term ethics, we're talking about a volume of information that is extensive. We could say thousands and thousands of years in the making, with millions of people, more than that, commenting on what it is. But then we condense all of that into the single term ethics. But as we continue condensing more information in this way, our rate of errors starts to increase as well. And so it seems like there's actually a trade-off that might be creating this Shannon, what'd you call it? Shannon limit?
Well, that's probably not what you're referring to there, but
okay.
Yeah, no. You're absolutely right, though. There is definitely a balance between efficiency and effectiveness.
So what do you mean then, Nick?
By we might make a fatal error by over heuristic. I'm making words up now.
I see.
By over heuristicizing our information.
Yes. Yeah. By putting too much trust into the symbols that we've created.
To condense the information. Yeah.
Right. So that's authoritarianism, right? That's when the rigid structures of culture have become unable to change. And not just change from without, right, but change and adapt to the individuals from within. This would be akin to something like ignoring the giant tumor growing on my leg, right? So like in a cult that isolates itself, it usually dies not because it's isolated, let's say, but because most cults have problems within the community, right? And those just spin out of control without any exchange of information outside, and it just leads to chaos within the boundary.
Yeah. Well, and the other side of that is if they've cut off their consumption, then there's also this starving that starts to happen, and that raises the internal tension of the cult.
So you said cults.
Right? So if you're in a tribe and you're running out of food, the internal dynamics of the tribe become vastly more sporadic as everyone starts to starve. They all start to get more violent, right?
Yeah. So because
it's kind of attacked from both directions when this isolation happens.
Yeah, because when you're running out of resources, there's like a higher urgency in the protection of your own self and your own family, to the point where it's no longer a ethical inhibition for yourself to steal from your neighbor's stock to feed your own family, because that's the only resource that's available at this point in time, and so like you become more selfish out of survival mode.
Yeah, so we can say that this is an interesting observation, because I think that points to something like one of the strongest associations we can make with whatever the life force is, that it's this sense of needing to persist through time, like whatever it takes, just keep going, just go, right? Live forever is essentially what it wants to do, and it does. It just does it in nodes.
even to the point of adapting itself so that the thing that the thing that it becomes is vastly different from the thing that it started off as.
Right.
Like to the point of like identifying with the very thing that is corrupting you, or identifying with the very thing that is destructive to yourself, so that you suddenly become the thing that survives.
It'll sacrifice itself to the process.
But it does strangely converge on similar answers. So in evolutionary biology, you have the concept of evolutionary design that is convergent for one particular reason, based on a similar lineage. And then you have another reason, there's a totally separate organism that just developed, like the bat, let's say, right? That's a great example. The bat produced wings, even though it's a mammal, just like a bird did, right? That is a kind of a strategical solution. That's what they chose to do, is fly, which is a really this is a great example, actually, of the tension between efficiency and effectiveness. Why on earth would you ever build an organism that flies? It's such an obscene waste of energy, you think, right? Like, why try to launch off the ground?
Especially initially.
Initially, right? Like, what on earth are you thinking? But look at flying fish, man. Why would a fish want to leave the ocean? What are they doing up there? I'll tell you what, they're trying to get to the sun. Okay.
Well, I was just thinking about it in regards of predator avoidance. So, like, if there's like a snake
avoidance or food.
Well, for a flying fish, I don't. Well, I guess you could catch a
there might be insect. I don't know. Flying fish are pretty far out in the ocean. I was thinking, if they were like in a swamp, it might make more sense.
I was thinking, like, if something's
catch bugs
coming towards your school, if you jump out of the water, you have entered a new space where the predator itself is incapable of entering. And similar to, like, if like there's a snake or something and you're capable of leaping high into the air right when they're about to strike, then it like puts you into a different zone than they're capable of.
Do you think there are like stories amongst the flying fish, like Icarus stories, like don't fly too close to this? Like, you think
I hope
daddy flying fish are telling their children, like, don't fly too close? No, but this is really interesting, right? These are the two pressures, it seems like. So there is the pressure from behind not to die by being eaten and consumed, becoming the food of something else, right? And then there is the pressure to make something else into food, your food, right?
Yeah.
And you're the weird tube in the middle that's funneling the energy from this side and trying to escape the energy on this side. Yeah. So strange. Why are we all doing that? But we are, and that's just like, that is the impelling drive of life. It's to
that's the craziest thing.
Our tubes.
It's like two drives at the same time, and like you have to make some sort of measurement between which drive you're going to be applying to whatever given situation you're in.
That's why the two hemispheres. That seems to be primarily, like, as you start to divide up various propensities and behavior, it seems to be something like that, like something devoted to a predatory prey mindset and the balance between those two things, especially as mammals, right? We're very used to this concept of both running from the snake or the owl at night, and also trying to eat smaller mammals. And yet, and this is so strange, right? Like another middle ground, we nurture our young, right? Rather than like fish eating them 30 seconds after we've hatched them, because we just do that, right? Although cats eat their babies from time to time. Anyhow, there's this weird middle ground that we've achieved where we care for something that is no longer us, right? It's like plopped off of us and separated. And ordinarily you just kind of care for what is within your boundary. But now you're recognizing that there is a thing that's once was you, but is no longer in your boundary, but it's outside your boundary, and yet you still strangely care for it, right?
Well, I think there's also an advantage to that, because when you get too old to continue only caring about you, you need something else to care for you back.
Yeah.
So there is a trade-off that we're making. Granted, it wouldn't have occurred within a person's single.
Or you could end up as an Inuit and find out that they just stick you out on an ice floe when you get too cold.
Yeah.
You're like, oh man, a bum deal on that one.
But I think it has to do with like, I think identity itself is something that is almost fluid in a sort of way. Like we can ascribe our own identity onto things external to ourselves. So like you can look at your child and see yourself in him, like a reflection of yourself there in the face of your own child, and like you're no longer identifying directly with your composition of organisms and microbacteria and all of that together into one singular thing, but you can identify to something larger than yourself. And I think like that has to do with like the cults that we have, or our national identities, or our social identities, things like that. Like you identify with the cause itself, like for an ideology or for the country itself in like times of war. It
seems like whatever's local, right? Like whatever's local to us, we're most interested in.
Well, I think it's like what I was saying, where even when presented with like something that is going to destroy the very like prior conception of identity, we identify instead with that thing that has like forced itself onto us. So I'm thinking about this in regards to, I guess, maybe too specific of a case, but like somebody that might have some sort of abuse as a child, where in order to cope with that, they have to, I guess, segregate their identity of who they were prior to that, and instead like identify with some different person from that. Well, that's kind of too specific of a case for dissociative identity disorder. But I think also just I think
I'm not sure exactly where you're going with that, but I do think that's how certain pathologies in the brain occur.
Sure.
So schizophrenic tendencies, I think, like the propensity to hear harsh and accusatory voices, right? This is a very common schizophrenic symptom, right? I mean, I can do that right now. I'm hearing my own voice like be accusatory to me and whisper like, and if I do something wrong, maybe I can do that. I can get frustrated with like, stupid, Tyler, stupid, right? You can do something like that, right? And I can imagine that if I lost control of that little neural cycle, that it could kind of live on its own off in the dark. And that
if you feed it.
Or if I feed it, right, continually. And that's kind of the key. You keep feeding it and you feeding it and you feed it. And at some point, or in early young adulthood, let's say, which is typically when it hits, the other portions of your brain that should be mature enough to help build these new structures to control what was building in the background are not strong enough, and they break free, and they are the loudest signals in your brain, and that is what you hear, right? Because we pay attention to whatever's loudest. That seems to be what we do in terms of decibel strength, whatever the signal is. So yeah, it has something.
I wonder how that, because well, I wonder if there's another part of the brain that is responsible in some sense for picking out what the loudest sound is. Like, is it its own loop that is taking over, or is it something else hyper focusing on that one, right? Its salience gets boosted through the roof.
Yeah,
I guess it would be
it's coordinated.
Probably more of a neuroscience question. But.
Yeah, well, it's coordinated almost certainly, right? So you have that, like the brain is just you can kind of think of just all these random modules firing together in correlated patterns, right? The timing is just kind of correlated. So if you have phenomenal experience like running, like it's an experienced loop, and then you have something like a dopaminergic satiation loop running at the same time for whatever reason, and those two get associated, right? It produces in some other portion, let's say, the encoded memory of how to unite those things, right? And a lot of like self psychological work or shadow work or however people want to describe it is trying to reroute these associations, these correlations, it seems like changing the way that we bring in these various interrelated parts of the brain, or changing the way that certain things are triggered and where they lead. Yeah, so it's
interesting. I'm diabetic, and
one or
when
two.
you're one,
Yeah, you're pretty
um,
or two. My aunt,
yeah.
one too.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems to be becoming quite common. It's very strange. I got it
All
really
the
late
autoimmune
too. I was 22.
conditions. You got it when?
Yeah, going through the roof when I was 22,
Really?
which is late for type 1 usually.
Extremely late.
But the reason I was bringing it up is because when our blood sugar drops, we have partial seizures. So the various parts of the brain stop communicating with each other. And it is really interesting to reflect on those experiences.
Yeah.
Because you're aware still of all those various parts of your brain still going off. It's just that they stop talking to each other. So like, for example, I remember dropping down into the high 20s, which is pretty low for a blood sugar amount. And I could still move and act. I didn't have physical, like sometimes people have physical reactions where they start doing some weird stretch or whatever. I didn't have any of that, but I lost the ability to understand words.
Mm-hmm.
And it was bizarre because I still knew all the words. It wasn't like people were suddenly speaking gibberish. I knew all the words. And I even knew that they had meanings. I just couldn't connect the sound to the meaning.
Yeah.
Was it kind of like when you repeat a word over and over and over and over and over
Yes.
and over and over and over,
and then it
to the
just
point
sounds
where
like sounds instead of being strongly connected to the rest of the framework, making the symbol have a meaning. But it was quite literally like the two sections that normally communicate with each other just stopped, but you could still feel it trying to get there.
Yeah.
You know, again, it wasn't just
like,
gibberish. It was words that had no meaning.
you can think of the meat as like little combustion engines, right? And suddenly the gasoline is trickled, right? And they're just kind of and they're trying to get the gears going, and the other parts are getting more blood flow still, and more glucose, right? And then so they're still going, and they're like, why are we not getting the signal from that? What's going on? This is really strange, right? This is really weird. Yeah, it's when the brain malfunctions is in fact when you first learn that consciousness is far stranger than you ever thought it was. Like, to be alive and experience things is far stranger than you ever thought.
Yeah, well, and you really start to wonder, right? It's at least from what I've heard, it's pretty well established now that there's no meeting ground in the brain, right? There's not a spot in the brain where all the information comes together to synthesize a single experience, which we normally agree is how we experience reality. It's all synced up as a single thing. But it's very bizarre. It's almost like the entire brain is conscious in its own isolated areas, and yet the only way it actually comes to mean anything is when it's all working together.
Yeah, meaning is coordination, it seems like. It's the coordination over time. So the most meaningful things to us are those things which resonate with the most persistent structures in our brain, right? That's why something like sex is so powerful, right? Like, it's extraordinarily meaningful for one to reproduce through sex. Therefore, it is the most powerful drive. Next, food, or let's say food is probably stronger than sex. Yeah. Right. Let me rearrange that. I'm a man though, so naturally I want to say that's.
we like to boost that signal pretty high.
I honestly, I can imagine scenarios. So anyhow, there is a way, yeah, to kind of hierarchically rank these things, and I think that's part of what Maslow was doing, say, in his understanding of how to coordinate desires. But
well,
yeah,
I'm not sure if they're always at the same ranking. I think it's like
no.
that we can like reorganize them,
Yes.
or you can adopt like false drives. So like even when you're playing chess, it's not like we have a chess drive that, but it's we act as if we have some sort of chess drive to make the opponent fail.
No, like you could imagine a world in which at every time you won chess, your opponent slapped you in the face and said, "I hate you," right? And then therefore winning is like not a good thing.
A bad thing.
Yeah. It's like it's just very easy to imagine the opposite scenario.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can imagine these alternate realities and then act off of them, but it's only when our imaginations of like what we expect aligns with the reality upon acting that we label these imaginations as being true, or if when we act upon it and we do not result with the expected outcome, do we label them as false?
Well, so when you do these reimaginings, they're a bit of a linguistic illusion, I think, but they're useful because what they do is they highlight those things which are consistent across time or consistent across various conceptions of the universe. So like if you redefine winning as something that you don't want to do, then it's called losing, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a linguistic wordplay. And so what you've now discovered is that in the universe, or in a universe where you can behave, where you have actions, there is the thing which propels you from behind, which is not wanting to get smacked in the face, right? And then there is the thing which compels you to move towards it,
drawing
which is
you towards it.
The satiety of like seeing the smile of your opponent saying, "Oh, you got me again," and knowing in like parts of your brain have successfully executed their program again.
The serotonin release of having dominated.
all of the women in the crowd are storming the stage because chess is the most attractive thing in the world.
Or just proving the intellect or some. It's very strange. Why do we have such a strong drive to prove ourselves superior? I guess it's just that's how we keep getting better through iterative generations.
Well, I think that like bringing up those two things it draws at least the distinction I have in mind when I think about what are ethics and what is, say, morality. Whereas morality has the understanding of there being some sort of end goal or result that you're hoping to attain.
A telos.
A value, whether it be individually or collectively, like a group's morality. You're acting within a, like, say, as a team, say in say football, something like that. There's the end goal of winning that game, where you're acting not individually, but as a component to a larger part. But also, and the distinction between, say, a morality and an ethic, where an ethic seems to be the inhibitions without the positive incentivizing structure. So, like that, I imagine it as like the state's laws, where you have speed limits, you have like don't murder, right to bear arms, all these inhibitions for how we're allowed to act with each other. But there's no central guiding force or value or telos that we're attempting to reach. It's just a set of practices that is imposed upon you, that if you do not abide by these rules, you will be punished through some sort of negative reinforcement. And it's like having only a set of ought nots it's not like man can't live with just a set of ethics or principles. He has to have some sort of motivating factor behind why these principles and ethics are even adopted in the first place.
And I was actually going to ask, as you were setting that up, like, what are we looking at then? When we come across a figure like a Christ or a Buddha, or where they go against the
culturally accepted set of rules for the time.
What makes people make new cults, really? And how does it actually work? Right? Because it does have the effect of almost like they swallowed a whole world into themselves.
Yeah, I think it's an observation of impending doom, failure for the set of principles that are currently in place. So, like for Socrates, there's the observation that this democratic, I guess the top-down kind of over the aristocracy would be limited, or I don't know. I'm not as familiar with Socrates, so maybe I should instead move to Jesus, where, okay, so in Jesus' case, the Pharisees, they had these high principles and these laws and rules that they kept themselves according to. But I guess bringing up kind of the case that I was bringing for that, having a set of laws and codes leaves one with a kind of, it leaves you the wiggle room to act in sin in other ways, because you're justifying your sin by abiding by the letter of the law rather than while still sinning in regards to the spirit of the law. That might be one way in which Jesus was attempting to update the rule set for his current culture and time and place.
I see. So, but even to, okay. But then, right, because it has written into it his own self-sacrifice as part of doing that, which you would think is antithesis to the goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe it isn't, because right, we could say then that humans are so social a creature that it's whatever built into us that we will sacrifice ourselves for the greater whole. Granted, there's a lot of counterexamples to that, but
there's this. Let me see if I can find
it gets
well,
weird.
I think so it's ever further weird elaborations on very simple concepts again, like physical concepts. So you breathe in and then you breathe out, right? But if you breathe in and hold your breath, you're done. Like there has to be a flow. You have to be able to breathe stuff in and then let stuff back out. And you have to find a way to do that that's pleasing to your organism, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you're asking in like what would lead an individual to be willing to die for a cause that they're not going to be able to experience the fruits of. So there's this quote from Nietzsche. One should die proudly when it is no longer possible to live proudly. And I think that's like a good articulation of, say, the death of Socrates, where it's like he reached a point where if he did nothing, he might live in misery based upon I guess his own conscience kind of weighing on him, to the point where it would be better to die doing what you know is for, I guess, the greater good, or the world that you seek to.
It could even at that
create.
point just be a personal good. It doesn't even have to be greater at that point.
Yeah, like it could be the selfish desire of Socrates to live a heroic death that's talked about even today.
The weird part, right? The heroic. right? Because it triggers something not only in the individual but in everyone else.
Well, yeah,
Right? When we relate Socrates' death, there's something in us that is extremely moved by it, much more so than Socrates, was real smart and everything, and he wanted to create change, but then he backed off because he didn't want to die. Like that.
Yeah, it's
We'll still respect
martyrdom.
him, but it doesn't trigger that whatever that. I guess Joseph Campbell had I forget what he called them, but he basically thought that there was a mythogenic circuit or trigger in the brain that enacted a different mode of being.
Yeah, so the mythopoetic creation is transcendental. That's the way I see it. It's like it is shirking the remember we were talking about the basest rule that we have for life is to persist through time, to never give up, to just keep going.
Yeah.
But he shirked that in favor of principles seemingly transcendent, right? Something that he felt was so true it would persist even through his death, and yet in fact would be tainted by him living if he were to deny it, right? So it's like this weird acknowledgement of something that persists beyond his life.
And like, if he didn't die for it, then these ideas would die. Perhaps.
Correct.
Yes.
Because it's that fuel that keeps the idea going.
Here's a counterpoint. Why do we mythologize, say, Socrates or Christ, but we don't mythologize, say John Jones? Is that the right name? The Kool-Aid guy.
Talking about Kool-Aid guy? Okay.
Yeah. Right?
Because
there is an aspect of sticking to a transcendental, and that might not be, there might be other examples we could use, Heaven's Gate or something. But is it proximity? Like we know those stories too well, and so we can see delusion in it? Like why is there a repulsive reaction, even though it appears to be so similar? Like what is deciphering Socrates's heroicism from, Heaven's Gate's mass suicide?
Well, it seems one is a self-sacrifice and the other is an enforced sacrifice of others, right? It's rather than the self-sacrifice, you're asking others to die. It's an external. It's like the way I see it is. So I have a very religious background, and so I use a lot of religious language sometimes to coordinate some of these concepts. But
does not Christ also warn or tell, following me will kill you?
Yeah, right. Or to pick up your cross.
But he's not commanding them to kill themselves. I guess there still is a difference. He's saying that living under this principle will cause this, but it's not. Oh man.
Yeah, he also says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. So there's an inherent element of paradox in here, I think, which is important, and it's the paradox that leads you to consider the transcendental argument.
Yeah, the transcendental.
So that's what's needed, I think. Yeah. That's why many of his parables were seemingly paradoxical with the context, because it's just like the Eastern tradition. It's designed to kick your current loop out of its loop so that you can examine other patterns, right?
Yes.
Another repetition of that behavior in another format is what you were discussing earlier in the cult behavior, where restricting certain avenues of behavior allows other avenues of behavior to flourish, right? We're always redirecting these flows of energy.
Open. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the difference is just that it's, which is all, okay. So this is what really drives me crazy is the Abrahamic sacrifice. Okay. Because here you have not a self-sacrifice. Here you have Abraham sacrificing his own son. It's no longer, but is it self-sacrifice or is it not? Because we were just discussing the strange relationship of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Am I my father?
Well, and the whole point was and the context of that sacrifice was that the son was the representation of what Abraham had placed above God.
Hmm.
Right?
Well,
That was why he was being asked to do so.
the son
That's
was
how I
like
understood it. Maybe I'm making that up.
No. I don't think I've heard that one.
Like, because all prior to that, the son was the.
It was the promised.
Yes,
It's
why he followed God to begin with, was many sons or many. Yeah,
right. Yeah. The promise of life, the promises of life, right? It seems to be
yes,
food unending, right? Which is like resources unending, land unending, the ability to reproduce, and unending prosperity. That is like the basest goal of life itself, the Abrahamic covenant, kind of codified in Jewish tradition and history. Life itself.
so, that makes it even weirder, though. Then that he's then asked to sacrifice that exact promise.
Yeah and no. I will still like the same thing is tied up in Christ, right? Christ on the cross.
Yes.
It's all very weird. Like it's all really, really weird when you start to pull it all.
Really? Well, that's what makes it so fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so why? But why is it weird? If this is reality, if this is the way things always ever could have been, why does what the hell is the sensation of things being weird anyways?
Weird.
Right?
I guess it's in a sense we're.
What are you comparing it to?
If you're accepting it as truth, then you could say that we're living in a falsehood that views truth as weird. So we're being gaslit by truth itself.
Yeah.
Then how did you ever get to the point to begin with?
Well, that's the story of Garden Eden, I think. It's this weird, and it's the story of each of our youth, the awakening of consciousness. Like it's a fog. None of us came to consciousness in a moment. It's this weird, foggy history of there's no boundary there. There isn't a consciousness boundary. There's a grading, right? It's layers.
Yeah, well, and it usually nonetheless hinges on very bright experiences, or I should say very salient experiences, such that we can, in a sense, almost trace back.
And yet the range is extraordinary, right? Like if you were in a dark room, the sensitivity of your eye is enough to detect like a single photon sometimes. So
yes,
like the range of experience, and it's especially the case if you're desensitized or hypersensitized, right? To these various stimulus. So like if I'm in a room alone by myself in silence, and I step outside and hear birds chirping, it's going to sound different than if I work at a zoo all day and I have to listen to these birds damn chirping, right? It has to do with the orienting reflex and the way that we view signals over time. And that, I think, again, is tied to an even deeper principle, which is something like this weird desire for newness, right? Like you can't persist in the same cycle. It won't let you.
Yeah.
You get used to the same signal. Your brain's like, we don't even see that anymore, right? It just stops paying attention to it.
It's quite literally death. We could call death, in a sense, a perfectly same signal, even if that signal is just the same because it doesn't exist,
right?
Or,
Yep. Well, it's I guess you could look at it that way.
Two things never change.
And that's where like zombie type mythology starts to come in, where it's almost or right, an undead. You're animated, but you're stuck in the same cycle over and over and over again.
I actually think the zombie and tell me what you think of this idea. The zombie and the vampire are archetypally dominant for reasons. I think they actually represent kind of the worst archetypal fear of each of the opposing hemispheres. The one hemisphere, maybe you can tell me which one you think is which, right? That cannot stand the concept of mindless action, right? Without thought, without feeling, without beauty.
Mm.
And the other is pure beauty, right? Pure eternal unchangingness, but without emotion, without or like a cool, logical, cold calculation. There are these fears, I think, that the hemispheres have of what the other hemisphere is like, so to speak.
Like
Yeah. So
interesting.
if the right hemisphere is always wanting beauty and aesthetics, and it's arguing with the left hemisphere about how to accomplish that, it's like, come on, I just want to look at pretty pictures all day. In the case of men, it's like, I want to look at porn all day or something, right? And left hemisphere is like, no, we have got to order something. We have got to build a structure. We've got to make sure something fits and works. And there's always this weird argument. So I think if you take it to its extreme, those are the intense fears of each hemisphere. And that's why that we've kind of gravitated to those two dominance. And you'll notice, I think, that men gravitate towards zombies and women gravitate towards vampires.
Vampires. Interesting.
Well, zombies
that's a
are
fun one. I'll have to think on that. That's fun to play with. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I was just trying to think of like how old the zombie archetype has been, I guess, salient, because it's kind of received a resurgence in pop culture through.
You'll have to ask the
Pixies
ants that have
upwards.
been dealing with the fungi that have been
Oh yeah.
hijacking for millions of years, right? What are their stories about zombies?
Can you imagine like being one of those ants and then like your buddy is just being a complete idiot and like walking up and then doing the like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be working here.
Yeah, and then to watch a fungus erupt out of his forehead and grow up into the air and release spores.
Yeah. That would be a nightmare. An ant's nightmare. Possibly as bad as an anteater, like attacking the colony.
Yeah.
Very different kind, I guess. I guess that would be almost like a Godzilla scenario where you're just an ant and suddenly there's this animal evolved to destroy your entire colony.
We get so freaked out by this concept of something like cordyceps hijacking a brain, but it's no different than with a meme, right? It's no different than that structure itself. Like we're envisioning like a fungal structure erupting out of an ant's head, but it's the structure is actually in reverse. It's erupting through your ear. The meme comes into your ear or your eye and builds a structure on the inside of your head.
Right? Yeah, there's kind of like, I guess, the dismissal of like memes as mind viruses because we have this belief that we have control over like what things we accept and what we reject. But in fact, like you can never leave a mimetic or mental worldview that does these evaluations for you. And like at certain times you can like transfer between which mimetic worldview you're using, but that's just like switching between brain viruses that are there collected in your head. So like you can
this might be a good place for me to jump in with my cult experiences in that I was going into particularly this last one because it's the only one I actually consciously chose, thinking very much and even setting up defenses so that I could explore it and return to my familiar mimetic framework if it went awry. Except that didn't work. So what happened is that I exited my familiar mimetic framework, took on this new one, and now I can't get rid of it. So what I've found myself, so I've disavowed it, and yet it's still operating. It's still running in my head. And so now I feel stuck in between, like in a limbo zone between the mimetic frameworks. And it makes it very difficult, right? Because then if I try and return, it feels like I'm putting on dead skins and trying to reanimate them.
Yeah, you
and
can't put the genie back into the bottle.
Yes, yeah, but very much a Pandora's box type thing.
Exactly.
And then I can't move into the new mimetic framework either, so it has a very bizarre effect.
Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
But please.
When you envision this movement into a new skin, um, how are you drawing a boundary between these mimetic structures?
I would say that it's primarily, I'm using a heuristic based on a very large number of sensory signals occurring, I would say, everywhere in the body. But they're particular. And that's probably the primary means. What's it actually, like there's almost like a physical imprint of the mimetic framework. And then it translates into thoughts and ways of expressing. But I would say that's how I'm actually deciphering the two.
Could you assign like a ratio of truth and falsity to the mimetic framework? I mean, I'm assuming that you're wanting to leave it behind because it represents some element of falsity in your life or something that isn't adaptive anymore.
Yes. So, well, and that's the problem, is that I've judged. Yeah, that is tricky. I'm trying
like
to extract
true and 20% false, or
I would, well, that's the hard part, right? And that's, I try and have these conversations largely, I feel like, in an attempt to salvage the parts that were useful and true and be able to put them in a different framework so that I can throw the falsehood away.
That sounds totally normal.
It sounds normal. I guess it's probably just maybe well, no, it's not even.
Sounds like
I would
a
say
learning
there's probably
experience.
lots of people that experience that. Yes.
I mean, I don't know if they use the word cults or that their experience is related to cults, but I think that same pattern of learning is what we're all going through, I guess. Like it, you especially very strong patterns, right? Like,
yeah,
foods, man. Foods are so strong in our culture, right? You eat the same foods, you end up with these same patterns. It's how we have culturally defined foods. How do you break out of them, right? How do you break out of them? How do you let a part of yourself die? That's the question, right? How do you let a part of yourself die?
Yeah, well, and right, that's it's interesting because it is, with this reanimating old versions of myself in an attempt to have some sense of ground again. Mm-hmm. It's weird because it felt like I let part of myself die. That's what it was, moving knowingly into the cultic structure. And maybe that's part of it too, is that it's actually easier when you're unaware or when you get possessed by a meme without consciously choosing it.
You don't even realize it's a meme. It's just reality.
You can't clutch to your last dying personality vestiges.
Yes.
If you don't know they're disappearing. So
exactly.
Yeah, that's why childhood is, by the way, I think, blissfully ignorant and unaware. I think that's why it's a mist of a conscious experience, because it's such an incredibly painful experience. Constant death, constant birth, constant also death. If you listen to a newborn baby, you can kind of hear it in their cry. It's a weird mix of like ecstatic appreciation for the weirdness of life, but also terrifying, like just. And if you've ever taken strong hallucinogenic drugs, I think there's a very
you feel it happening in the moment.
Yeah. So I actually think that little babies are just like experiencing a very long, strange DMT trip.
Yeah,
that's how I think.
I would.
Yeah, they're like permanently dosed in a hallucinogenic state as their brain is wiring, right? And it's just ecstatic, euphoric, and strange and weird in every way. Because, I mean, try to imagine not having the proper firing signals for all of your limbs, right? Like your ability to define the space that you live in and to feel as though it's actually still. Like if you had an inner ear problem right now, your world wouldn't even be still. The very ground you're on would be shaking.
Shaking.
Right? Which is crazy. So imagine as a baby, like nothing no signals are timed
Has
properly.
that
Your
stability.
world is just this weird, shaky, watery, fluid, unrestrained, chaotic mess. It's they're either on something powerful and strange, or they're terrifying experiencers. Just you got to have PTSD. Maybe that's what adulthood is. It's like PTSD of childhood, right?
That's what's creating the stability. That's actually really interesting. Because that's like a quality of PTSD. You get stuck locked within a context, and you can't recontextualize the experiences.
Which is why Christ said that you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a little child.
As a child, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know, like Aldous Huxley, he had, I guess, the theory of the brain as an inhibitory structure for consciousness in its fullness. So, like, when you have these types of when you have the hallucinatory drugs, things like that, it's the openness to consciousness in like no limitations imposed upon it, but rather everything all at once to the point of like maximal salience. Even for like he writes about his experience just spending like hours staring at the legs of a chair and just receiving immense amounts of meaning just from like seeing the intricacies of all of it. And like it's only after, I guess, the PTSD of having to exist within a world of resource deficiency that these categories and structures have to be imposed upon reality so as to act within it and to achieve a sufficient amount of needs being satisfied in order to continue existing within reality.
Yeah, so we can define let's say a generalized concept of a happy organism as something like, so there's the tube, right, that passes energy through it. And then there is the pressure of death and predation from behind, and the desire of resource gain from the front. And the happy creature is one where the flow of energy between those two poles is non-turbulent. So to give an example, something like a rat living in a city has all the pressures of dogs and cats in its environment chasing it down, and because of that, it represents a certain level of anxiety and cortisol and all of that stuff associated neurologically within the rat, right? As the number of dangers increase, the structures associated that within the rat increase, right? It changes the shape of it. And at the same time, the rat is looking for food, but it's finding less and less scraps. So its avenues of behavior into the future are now being narrowed and limited. So we could say that the health of that organism, this is kind of approaching more towards a Sam Harris perspective on well-being, let's say, if he's looking for a secular definition of morality. The well-being of this creature is then defined as something like the non-turbulent flow between these two.
The ratio. Well, and it's like you stuck a pressure valve on the end of a hose, right? It's going to create a turbulent flow at the end of the hose. And that's characterized by the reduction of resource. So it has too much cortisol coming in through, or pressure, right? Predatory pressure coming in through one end of the hose, and then it's being restricted at the far end, which creates this
which creates
turbulence.
Yeah, which creates like frustration, right? It's like a squeezing and a crushing feeling. I don't know how you experience frustration, but it's like
things colliding into each other, energies running into each other, such that what comes out is just this crappy little
right.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, Nick, about something you had mentioned earlier, how like the manipulation of salience through the use of cults by like having a heightened sense of salience. And I was thinking about how like there's the crisis of meaning within like the Western world right now, and Paul Vanderklay puts it as like the fat man's disease, because like the crisis of meaning is not really something that you would find somewhere in
it's one of over satisfaction.
Yeah, it's almost like there's no longer the necessity or the drive of having things coming after
There's
you.
no predator coming for you.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Snowflake generation, exactly.
And so you create predators. You have to, in a sense, become hypersensitive to predatory behavior in order to simulate.
So that's where like you could fall victim to an ideology of oppressor versus oppressed or something like that, because that creates, or it imposes the category of predator onto like
the biological.
It simulates what we're familiar with.
Right.
Exactly what we're familiar with over a very long period of time. So all of the biological structures associated with the extraordinarily dangerous environment that we have in the past lived in still exist, and they don't disappear overnight because we're not willing to let them die, right?
Yeah. You'll notice too, apocalyptic myths persist in every era. And that might also play. I mean, I think there's other reasons for that as well, but it probably is also this, you know, pressurizing of a predator.
Yeah.
But a major culture that we have right now is a apocalyptic myth running.
Yeah,
and I'm saying myth in a loose. I'm not saying they aren't justified fears. I'm saying that relating to them.
I see them as
the green movement and stuff. Yeah,
the green movement falls in with that.
That's true.
All of these are like prophetic.
And it's.
I think we're having some delay. Yeah, there. What would have been considered in the past doomsday prophets, right? Like all of the green energy stuff is doomsday profiteering. Right? It's people looking into the future and saying this future is coming. This future is coming, and yet instead of calling them prophets, we call them scientists, and we think it's a difference.
Well, that you could argue has been the dominant point of science, is to replace prophets.
Yeah, but
whether very short term or very long term.
But the let's say the ecological benefit for the wider environment of having prophets is undoubted, right? So if you had a successful prophet in your tribe, he could successfully predict the future and tell you that there is a famine coming and you need to store up your foods. Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The same is true for Wall Street.
Yeah.
Wall Street has prophets, right? They have people who tell them what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes on the market. And if they're correct, they succeed. If they're not, we don't say that their science or that their vision was wrong. We say their math was wrong or something. Their science was bad.
Yes.
Even though it's no different. Like it's no different. It's like it's just a different shade of complexity, right?
Did you ever watch The Big Short? The movie they made about the housing crisis?
I didn't see the whole thing, but I did see parts of it. Yeah, it was
there's the one guy in his office that calls it, like a couple years ahead. And the whole time he's just sitting there, like the entire movie's just like him throwing a ball at a wall, waiting for the thing to crash. But it's that image popped into my head.
Well, what's really funny is these few seldom prophets that do get it right, the big things, the big guesses, right, the big events. They come out later and they're like, well, look, see, I told you, right? See,
yeah. Right. Well, and how many of them guessed and got it wrong, and he just,
Well, we have all these weird
in the right place at the right time,
and the way that we choose who to listen to. That's actually my only question, really, regarding cults is, how do you choose who to trust? How do you follow somebody, right? How do you follow anybody? I've always had such a problem with this. I guess I grew up as an only child for a while, so I have terrible problems with authority. Right?
Oh,
No,
I
no
do
dad.
as well. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, in like the first 3 cults I encountered, my entire mission was deconstructing. And I guess for me, what it was is it was a system with the last one, the one I did choose. It was a system I couldn't deconstruct. And
Oh,
the position that put me in was I need to either follow this because it's correct, or I need to learn more about it so that I can break it. And it was a simultaneous drive where it was both I wanted to destroy it and I wanted it to be correct. And that's what sucked me into it, if you will.
So can I ask then, led you to exit this cult if the very, I guess, mimetic substructure that it overlaid onto you has yet to prove itself as invalid?
It, to me, proved itself as invalid. And that's because it changed. So
Okay.
I still, in a sense, am clinging to much of its early formulation. That's the part that I'm trying to pull out. What was the good part in here? And why, right? It's seemingly, all right, you have this formulation, and now I can see that it only needed a couple triggers for that formulation to turn into something that I could recognize easily as not going to work or bad or whatever. So now it's almost like a process of combing through that initial formulation and trying to find why it was susceptible to the triggers that it was. Which is, it's not an easy
Are
process.
these new or strange triggers you're talking about, or are they behaviors that have persisted and are evidenced in humans for a long time? Like greed, jealousy. What is it that made it fall apart?
What made it fall apart?
I'm assuming it's falling apart because
Impatience, I would say, was the fundamental.
Impatience from yourself or an observation of impatience in the fellow cult members?
Because it changed its format, how it was going about functioning, rationalized specifically on the idea that it was going to be faster, that the formulation they had wasn't working fast enough to do what they wanted it to do. And so they reconfigured the formulation into something they thought would be more efficient. And when it did that, it turned into a classic cultic, negative cultic connotation. And that's when I left. And even then, right, because it's hard to, when you move into an entirely different mimetic framework, your discernment becomes really hard to keep hold of.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say probably the only reason I was able to tell was because I'd had 3 previous run-ins with cults that had deformed themselves. And that might have triggered enough like subconscious warnings for me to go, oh, this is not, it's off the track for sure now. But again, it's really hard to explain.
From the other ones.
Well, is it internal inconsistencies in the mimetic structure, or however you want to define it, or is it the behaviors produced by those structures? So let me give a metaphor, perhaps. Like I could play with a Lego set, and then I could look at a series of instructions about how to build something with the Lego set. But the picture could be something that's impossible to build with a Lego set, right? Totally impossible.
Yes,
right?
That would be the
play with the Lego
internal
set.
inconsistency.
Yeah, and I just keep playing and they just can't. Well, it's internally consistent. This is a consistent one. So the Legos will fit all together, and I can build whatever Lego set I want. but I think I'm going to be able to build something
I see.
I'm never going to be able to build, right? Maybe it's got wings of a particular shape that I just can't create.
Can't produce.
Legos, right? And somebody just gave me the wrong image. They were supposed to give me the Lego image, but they gave me the Tinker Toy image or something.
Well, I'm guessing that it is that one. And it's again really hard because the way that these people dealt with internal consistency was not consistent. But it was not consistent in a way that was generative. I don't know better words for this stuff. It's really
like they accepted their inconsistency for their own practice. Like it wasn't a problem for them, I guess.
Well,
Seeing
again,
it as a problem
it's
for them.
tricky. There were inconsistencies, but they this might work. There was inconsistencies, but instead of being contradictions, they were paradoxes. And they knew how to use the paradox to produce something greater. Whereas a contradiction just has that stopping power, turbulence, we could say.
Yeah. Yeah, paradoxes are portals. They're like the gate in the boundary condition that allow you to move into the transcendental. That's
yes.
Of them. They're the gateway.
And it was that their ability to play with those paradoxes in the way that they could, that was a major draw, because I hadn't seen anyone else able to do that in that way. But why did I leave? I guess you could say that those paradoxes, I don't know. It's so hard to put into words. They sacrificed the paradoxes and replaced them with contradictions, or rather they created a new set of paradoxes that were contradictory to the previous set of paradoxes, which is hard to imagine because of what a paradox is.
Is there a specific behavior or set of behaviors that you can refer to that might?
Yes. Yeah, many. And it all happened about, I'd say is about 8 months after I formally joined, that started going off the rails. And this is actually really interesting. I had an experience. You might have seen it in one of my interviews with Paul, with my ex-girlfriend who became schizophrenic after the car accident.
Right.
And then we were living on in a cabin in the Puget Sound up on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. So this is just weird from like a resonance point of view. There was a winter, so I joined in May of 2016, I believe, maybe June. That winter of 2016 moving into 2017, they had been going for 3 or 4 years before I joined with them. And this was never a successful cult. It had one member for those 3 years. And then by the time I came in, there was 3 of us, right? Not functional structure, you could say, or at least it hadn't achieved anything.
No experience.
Yeah. That winter, they were isolated in a cabin on or in the Puget Sound on the Olympic Peninsula. They started consuming a bunch of conspiracy theory material, which was not part of the cult beforehand. And that was the marked change where the cult, you could feel it just take a sudden direction off to the side. So as they were synthesizing all that information and trying to add it into the framework, there was a virus hiding in that information, we could say. And it threw the whole thing off. But that's where it really, basically it went from being a cult that was replicating religious structures into a cult that was replicating military structures, and overtly. So they literally appropriated military structures and started applying them.
The garb and the hierarchy.
Renamed the cult, like created a whole new structure. And this was weird because it was the two figures. It was a dude and his girlfriend. They were, I think he was 50 and she was 40. He was white, she was black. He's the one that created the original formulation of the cult. She created this military structure, and it was that thing that was, to me at least, very obviously wrong. And it went with a bunch of other weird stuff. But again, it had defenses in it that kept you from immediately being able to use your judgment. For example, it had a philosophy that the mythological structure that a person was using did not matter so long as it resulted in the desired state. So that would be like a pure pragmatism revolving around mythological structure. So it wasn't about what religion you subscribed to. It was if you subscribing to that religion in the way you did produced the desired effect. Well, after that winter, the girl thought she was an alien from a military that was seeking to do something on Earth. And so the immediate reaction, obviously, is to reject and go and kick it out and be like, oh, that's obviously fucking bullshit. The problem is that she didn't enforce it on us as people lower down. So we didn't have to believe that that's how the world was. And instead, what our judgment was to be based on was, did it result in her having the desired state, right? So you're trying to analyze the person, not the mythology. And that allowed, we should say, fuzziness to make it much harder to judge the situation. But this is when I started, and again, like I said, I was in this the entire time trying to blow it up as much as trying to believe in it. And that's when I started punching back against it. And so I would, basically trying to show off its inconsistencies and see if by showing off the inconsistencies, if I could break the system. And they're experts at what they did.
About that aspect of it, the fuzziness of the pragmatism of the belief structures. Do you feel like that's too much looseness? That there should be a kind of rigid, defined mythopoetic structure?
It's hard to say, because say even within more rigid myth, right, you kind of run into the postmodernist problem, which is that even if you define the source material rigidly, the interpretation of the source material is almost unlimited. Right? It's not infinite, or it is infinite, but it's a smaller infinity than pure make up whatever mythogenic structure you'd like.
Yeah. The way I envision that metaphorically, I guess, is something like you can take a single shape, like a cube, right, which looks the same from any angle from any person, right? It doesn't change. But if you stick it in like a hall of mirrors, you can make it look like almost anything from a certain angle.
Yes. Right. Yes. And a hall of mirrors, I think, is a great analogy for what it felt like being in this cult.
Yeah. Well, what probably, because you start constructing additional mirrors, right? Adding new mirrors.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, and yeah, exactly. You're adding your own into the situation, which ironically makes the situation more difficult, right? That's another aspect of this increasing ambiguity. You're adding to its ambiguity by partaking in it at all.
Yep. Or changing it, right? You imbibe the energy and then change it in whatever way you do, and spit it back out. But you
Yes.
were interested in very much in, well, I guess steel manning it is what you're doing it, right? You're trying your very best to see what truth lies within the framework.
Yes. Yes. And at the same time, again, it was the weirdest thing. I've never had this relationship with a formal system. But well, that might not be true. But concurrently trying to, like, wanting to destroy it. I didn't want it to be true. And at the same time, so confusing.
You are. So whenever I feel like I'm confused, like there's more than one of me inside that can't quite figure out what is, right? I remember that there is, in fact, more than one of me in there. At the very least, there's two hemispheres. And then within those two hemispheres, there's who knows what. And so when I can't figure something out, I can almost guarantee there's some silent partner in my brain that's holding on to some hidden nugget that's not revealed.
Yes.
It's like
exactly. Hence my attempt to try and unpack the parts I
feel like you want to like entice it, right? To like get it to, you want to draw it out. Uh-oh.
Oh no, he's frozen.
I think yeah.
It's a cute picture though.
Test it out. Useful. Working again?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, cool. We're back.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say maybe a familiar metaphor would be like the simultaneous desire of people to want there to be a god and to want there to not be a god.
Yes.
Right? Because the proposed idea of a god is like, well, now you have solidity, right? You have a real reality. You have a place to go. You have like all this stuff comes in, but at the same time, you also get absolute judgment. You get everything about you is known, and you get right. You lose your independent will.
Harsh reality. Harsh reality. The world steps in. That's the predator.
Yes.
And this is okay. So this is the visual image that brings tears to my eyes when I try to really get it right. So in some sense, God is like, our conception of God is built up over time, right? So as a child, we hear the word God, and what the hell is that? Thing in the sky, the old man with the beard, who knows, right? But as we age, we develop more and more awareness of the world, and our conception of who and what a God is increases over time, let's say. The capacities and avenues of what it could be start to shape. So one thing you're definitely confronted with is that reality doesn't care what you want it to be, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And so there's always a predator that could be ready to grasp you in its jaws if you step outside of that tree hole, right? And that's terrifying God. It's the God of death. We personify it in a million different ways, right? It's the God of consumption and the terror. And this is the Old Testament God. If you don't do the proper thing, you will die. That's the great terror of death that pushes us from back, right? In front of that, right, that's the Old Testament behind. In front of that is that which you desire, that which you love, that which you want to move towards, right? And that also exists at levels of understanding. First, it's simply a shiny object, right? But by the time you're an adult, it's the breadth and depth of human history and culture, or the romance that you've had with 3 or 4 people intimately bound and entwined in your lives. Like, your conception of love grows. To extend both of those concepts out in both directions towards the infinite, you end up with the Old Testament God that compresses and forces and through fear pushes you towards that which is appropriate. And then on the other side, you have the New Testament God, the God of love and desire, and that which brings together and causes you to want to approach. And both of those are the same God, because when you step outside that tube of the organism and the pressures that exist on either end of that system, the shape of that is an Ouroboros, so to speak, because the external environment, kind of like a Klein bottle, is all one aspect of the outside. So that God reaches from the back, the fear and the terrible nature of it, and the love on the front, all the way around to meet together, right? And not in the middle, but like inside and out, which is the weirdness of the Klein bottle, which is the weirdness of
in a dimension we can't actually parse.
The dimension of whatever possibility is, so to speak. It's very, very strange.
Right?
That's
a good word for it.
Okay, so those two elements are built up we deal with those two transcendental elements biologically in our brain with the two hemispheres. One wants there to be a God to move away from or towards, and the other one, no, right? Like self-determination. It's and it's also interestingly mirrored in the progress that you go through as a child, right? Like there's a forgiving, nurturing quality to the mother, let's say, or a harshness to the father that teaches you to be a man, right? Like even though pain is there, you have to do it anyways, right? Meanwhile, the mother's saying, don't worry about it. You don't have to do it. There's these two strategies, these two strange, mutually compatible and necessary alternate strategies.
Well, and that scary place to be, scary is a weird word for it, is right in between the forgivingness of the mother and the pressure of the father,
right?
Because it in a sense makes you feel like you don't have a direction to move in. You don't want to give up into the mother because of what the father's saying, and yet you don't want to commit to what the father's saying because there's always the chance of I could release, I could just relax, I could not do this. And they're balancing each other in a way where it almost is insufferable. Where it's filling you with so much turbulent energy, I suppose we could say. The two messages. And you could call that, right? That's the Buddha's middle path. That's Christ's eye of the needle, right? It's
straight path, exactly, right.
But you lose all sense of reality in that place. That's
no. You build reality in that place.
Build reality, yes.
You build it.
You lose all familiar.
But that's what we wanted. Okay?
Now we're in the fractal.
That's what we wanted. We didn't want to live forever with the same things, so we have this universe that produces novelty infinitely, right?
Yeah.
It's our fault.
That's exactly
what
it.
We wanted. See, if we take let's call it ultimate responsibility. Being the middle, being the pilot between the middle of eternities, right? Between the infinities that stretch behind you and in front of you, being that pilot, that's ultimate responsibility. Taking charge of all the pressures and momentums of the past and piloting it towards the future, that's ultimate responsibility. And it's fun, strangely enough, to describe it that way. It's exciting, it's invigorating, it's enlivening.
Oh, yep. I mean, that's all familiar stuff I experienced inside the cult.
Right.
It was, you're taking, and that was part of what I found so attractive about it initially as well, is most of the time, if you're, for whatever reason, dissatisfied with the current shape of the systems in place, your options outside of it are usually revolutionary options, which is to say they demonize it and then try to replace or destroy it. Their formulation was not a revolution in that sense. It was a synthesis. It viewed it as imbalanced, but not evil. Right? It produced evil because it was out of whack, but it wasn't bad in and of itself. And that desire to look for options through synthesis rather than the more familiar demonization and destruction, followed by a new creation, I found very...
It sounds a little Zoroastrian. Do you know of any the roots of what how it was?
I've never looked into Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
Oh, their roots?
Yeah, the roots of
their roots were of... I'm sorry, one more time.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Of how he initially developed it. Yeah, he may have come across something like that. I don't know.
I know a lot of it was biblical interpretation. He had experienced a state similar to a state I experienced, where this probably, yeah, there's a lot here that kind of leads up to this moment in my life. But I had a really intense experience in April or May of that year, where I had an experience of what I call a being of light that touched me on the forehead, which changed how energy flowed in my body, and then told me to stand up because I was kneeling. And it said, get up, get off your feet. And I was sober for this. This wasn't a psychedelic experience or anything. Which, and I trace some of this story out with Paul in one of the videos.
We might have to redefine sobriety.
Might have to what?
Redefine sobriety.
Oh, redefine sobriety.
Yeah, these kinds of transcendental experiences, right? They don't feel very sobering, or maybe
no,
ultimately sobering, perhaps. But yeah,
I didn't have any obvious external drugs in my system.
Right.
Yes. My diabetes went away for about a month and a half following that experience.
You mean
blood
sugar regulated itself, like you?
Yes. Yeah. With no insulin, and I was checking my blood sugar regularly with the finger prick, but
you kind of have
so
to.
I couldn't keep the experience fully in the realm of the psychic either, right? I was experiencing physical transformations, which made it very hard to ignore or to
explain.
Yes. My blood sugar destabilized after about a month and a half. The diabetes came back along with a really heavy emotional feeling. And it was in this state where I'd kind of blown up my life, my previous, like I had lost a lot of the anchors, that I then thought that, well, if the other things I was trying to do didn't work, then I'm supposed to go check out this cult. And again, it was from that perspective of like, I'm either here to ruin it or I'm here to listen to it. So again, it's really weird how strongly those people's experience mapped on top of my own. That's why I brought up the cabin situation and the schizophrenic girlfriend. They went through almost in the same place a very similar experience. So it's almost like I was repeating a point in my life, watching it externally instead of living it and trying to learn something from it. And I don't know what I was supposed to learn, I guess. But I'm getting off my train of thought here.
I hate that feeling.
Yeah. The last year and a half has basically been trying to make sense of all of that stuff. Meanwhile, I
you feel like you can, like that there's a Like there's a final sense that you'll be satisfied?
No, I don't. Well, that's not true. I don't think I'll be able to do it.
That makes sense.
It's not within my power to do, and maybe that's the point. Is like I'm burning out my attempt to synthesize it into something that is worthwhile.
Yeah, we need a balance.
But
we need a balanced mix of internal digestion and external ingestion, right? We have to take in the views of others so that we get an appropriate view of who and what we are. That's fascinating, though.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. You're like I would
weird.
describe you as like a cult penetration tester. You're like white hat hacker for cults. It's funny. The idea of that.
Well, yeah, and so part of coming out of that cult was also this full realization of how cultic the world I was living in before finding that cult also was. And that's like me trying to integrate back into normalcy in a sense. And then realizing that this normalcy is just another
go stand.
I can't get out of the cults.
Starbucks, okay, go and stand in line in a Starbucks or Black Friday, right? Look at the lines that form outside of the stores for Black Friday and the way they crush each other as they claw for the aisles. It's like once you step outside of any system for a little while, you get a nice clear view when you come back into a very oddity that we love to call
exactly
culture, right? We just get used to
it. Yes.
Get used to it.
So then, yeah, I guess my kind of panic response to that has been this really intense mental exercise of trying to map the experience out and find some type of formal system that I could make sense of it in, rather than just leaving it in this like kind of murky I guess emotional experience would be the right way to say it, but again, it feels more like a in the body sensation.
Well, it is
tricky. Yeah. Well, that's what an emotion is, right? It's just a series of internal body sensations, right? We feel love in the heart.
It's funny. Like everything is metaphorical in some sense. Processes resemble themselves. So we even use the same words, like I'm going to chew on that thought for a little while, right? So the process of digestion is you take something that isn't you, it's not even ready to be you, and you chew it up into little bits, you swallow it, and other parts of you mush it around, and then eventually it gets to a shape that your body can insert into a tiny little slot and use it, right?
Yeah.
You do the same thing with ideas.
Process the synthesis. Kick out the
eyes, right? Ears. And then it joins up with the parts that we ate through the mouth as energy to be restructured in some new weird way in the brains.
Yes.
What the hell are we doing?
This, I guess, it feels like I ate an elephant in one go, and it's it's not I didn't consume correctly, we might say.
Yeah. Well, I think so.
The system.
The oddity of the similarity of experience, that let's say the synchronicity of it. You said that. Right. The happenings on Puget Sound.
Yes. Yeah. Stay out of that area unless you're looking for something exciting.
Or we all are in some sense, I think.
Yeah.
The trade-off.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So.
No. I wonder about this sometimes, because the Eastern concept of reincarnation is associated with this idea of repeated patterns, vibration states that happen over and over until you reach another higher energy state and then kind of lock into that place, which is fascinating to me because it seems to describe what's happening with like electron shells and the way that molecules build themselves up over, like it's all kind of metaphorical with these same patterns repeating. So yeah, I see that. Like we go out into the field, we see flowers, we see a field of lilies, right? And we look at one of them, and it doesn't look all that dissimilar from its neighbor. And it doesn't look all that dissimilar from its ancestors, right? It's this one unique little flower. And we feel so unique, right? We feel like, it's this unique little flower, special snowflake. And yet, when we grow up and start talking to other people, we find out that there are these extraordinary coincidences of self-similarity, and you start to see the fractal repetitions, right? And even what's so shocking to me is not that the external phenomena are the same, not that, you experience these same things, but that when they go into the brain, we come up with the same ideas, right?
Yeah.
So when Leibniz,
how could that possibly?
Right. Yeah. When Leibniz and Newton needed to explain the universe, they both kind of squeezed out calculus. And when you or I go through some traumatic experience in life searching for truth, we squeeze out similar kind of philosophical musings, right? It's like it's a slightly strange variation on a flower, but nevertheless, we are these weird repeating patterns. And it's kind of comforting to me, I think about it that way. Like the universe goes.
It is comforting in that it gives a feeling of almost inescapability. Like, it's playing out as it's supposed to. And then it's also not, because, God damn it, I don't want to do that again.
Isn't Paul Calvinist?
Yeah, he's a Calvinist.
Yeah. That's probably very similar to how he feels about it. I need to have a talk with him one of these days. Great guy.
Yeah, he's a great conversation partner.
Mm-hmm. He has quite a breadth of knowledge, it seems, and a profound interest in things, it seems, right? And never.
Yes, and in people.
Things. Yeah, well, you kind of have to be in this line of work, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's fantastic. It's been oh man, I can't even tell.
It's been a long time. Holy crap!
Yeah. Oh. You guys want to wrap it up there? I guess I feel almost like spent everything we've kind of gone through, and like
my mind is definitely like.
Thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry it was so disorganized. Usually I like to be able to form it a little bit more, so I'm not sitting here stumbling over.
I'm not usually a very organized person, so it's probably at least a bit my fault.
We'll take mutual responsibility.
Some ratio. Who knows? Cool.
Cool. Well, it was wonderful talking to both of you. I very much enjoyed this.
Yeah, we should continue.
Yeah, definitely. Anytime. I am lacking for conversation partners, so.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got this thing we do roughly once a week. We've been kind of inconsistent lately due to each of us having certain things coming up, but yeah, we at least attempt to. I'll send you the link to our forums, and probably we have a wire that I'll add you on so that we can at least communicate. I don't know. I have your email at least, so we can schedule this again in the future. But yeah, I'll wrap it up. Got everybody watching, and thanks Nick and thanks Tyler for joining us for this and having such a vast and entertaining conversation. We have in the link below I guess the link to the forum, the discuss.bevry.me. Yeah, thanks for watching. So signing off.
Done.